How does a single family name come to be etched across the most prestigious cultural institutions in the world, and then, decades later, become something people wish to erase? There is a particular kind of silence in a museum after closing, when the visitors have departed and the guards move through empty corridors with measured steps. Imagine walking through such a space on a late afternoon, when the light from the high windows has grown thin and amber. The temperature in these halls remains perfectly controlled, year-round, a climate engineered for preservation. Your footsteps echo softly against polished floors. The air holds the faint scent of stone dust and the mineral quietness that surrounds old things. You find yourself in a gallery wing, perhaps in New York, or Los Angeles, or London. On the wall, you might notice it without thinking much. Sackler. The letters are carved into black marble, or inlaid in brass, or printed on a bronze plaque in understated serif font. The wing, the center, the institute, a family name rendered in the language of permanence and prestige. These letters suggest a certain kind of immortality, the kind that comes from placing your name beside art, beside learning, beside human beauty and achievement. Museums have long served as monuments to the tastes and generosities of families who possessed both vision and wealth enough to shape culture itself. But there is something suspended in this particular moment, in this particular silence, something that feels like a question waiting to be asked. For if you were to walk through this wing, past the carefully lit paintings, past the thoughtfully arranged antiquities, past the catalogues describing the collection's provenance and the donor's foresight, and if you were to ask yourself where the fortune that built all of this truly came from, the answer would lead you down corridors of a very different sort. Corridors lit not by museum lights, but by the fluorescent glow of pharmaceutical laboratories and corporate boardrooms. Corridors where decisions were made that would eventually reshape the landscape of pain, addiction, suffering, and death across an entire nation. The story of how a dynasty built their name, their wealth, and their monuments, and how that same name became something the world began to want to forget, is not a story of simple villainy or simple greed. It is far more intricate than that. It is a story about the 20th century itself, about ambition and medicine and the peculiar ways that capitalism learned to sell human relief, about how families fragment and reunite around business, how loyalty can become complicity, and how the most consequential harms are often wrapped in the language of care. This is a story about the Sackler family, and about how one pharmaceutical company bearing their name would come to flood the American heartland with a drug that changed everything. If you find yourself drawn to the hidden histories of the families and institutions that shaped modern life, to the intricate layers beneath what we see in museums and boardrooms and public squares, I would invite you to subscribe for more deeply researched journeys like this one, calm and unhurried, into the dynasties that quietly altered the course of nations and lives. Now, let us begin at the beginning. Picture New York City in the early decades of the 20th century. The century itself is still young, still discovering what it might become. Millions of people are arriving in America, stepping onto docks with everything they owned, searching for something they could not find elsewhere. Among them, around 1912, was a man named Isaac Sackler and his wife, Sophie. We know very little about their early lives in the places they came from. The specifics remain somewhat obscured by time and by the discretion that families often maintain about their origins. But we know that they settled in Brooklyn, which was then and now a world unto itself, a place of neighborhoods stacked upon neighborhoods, of immigrant communities and small businesses, of the particular kind of hustle and determination that builds something from almost nothing. Isaac Sackler was a physician, though the details of his training are sparse in the historical record. Medicine in those days was not the credentialed, standardized profession it would become. The lines between legitimacy and opportunism were far less clearly drawn. Sophie and Isaac had 3 sons, born across the opening years of the century. Arthur came first, arriving in 1913, then Mortimer followed in 1916, and finally Raymond in 1920. These 3 boys would grow up in a household where medicine and commerce were already intertwined, where the idea that a doctor could also be a businessman was not unusual or contradictory. Brooklyn in the 1920s and 1930s was a particular kind of place to be young and ambitious. The Great Depression would come, and it would reshape American life in ways both visible and invisible. But the Sackler family, by most accounts, did not suffer as severely as many did. Isaac had his medical practice. The family had shelter, and the 3 sons, Arthur especially, seemed to possess a certain hunger, a certain awareness that education and enterprise could be leveraged into something larger. Arthur was the most driven of the 3 brothers, or perhaps the most visibly ambitious. He was intellectually restless. He studied biology and medicine at City College of New York, completing his medical degree at New York Medical College. But he did not seem content with the simple business of doctoring, of seeing patients in an office and dispensing diagnoses and medications. Something in his temperament, something in his understanding of the world, suggested that the real opportunity lay not in treating individual patients, but in understanding how to reach them, how to shape their desires, how to make them want what you were selling. Mortimer and Raymond would follow different paths, though their paths would eventually converge again around a family business. Mortimer also studied medicine, becoming a physician. Raymond pursued dentistry. But what united all 3 brothers was something less tangible than their formal credentials, a sense that the family's future lay in the intersection of medicine, marketing, and the pharmaceutical industry, a sense that a fortune could be built there and a name could be made. And so we come to the mid-20th century, to the post-war years when America was discovering itself anew. The soldiers were coming home, the economy was humming with possibility. The suburbs were being born, and medicine was entering a new era, one in which pills and injections and pharmaceutical solutions were beginning to seem like answers to almost everything, to nervousness and sadness and pain and sleeplessness, to the ordinary difficulties of being alive. Arthur Sackler understood this shift intuitively. He could see what was coming, and he began to position himself, and his family, at the center of it. In the quiet hum of institutional corridors, there exists a particular kind of silence, the silence that follows a name being removed from a wall. The Sackler name has become something many institutions now struggle to speak aloud, and yet the story of how it came to rest there in the first place, how it rose and accumulated and finally fractured, remains one of the most intricate narratives of power, medicine, and consequence in modern history. There are other dynasties like this one, families whose names came to represent entire eras or industries, whose influence spread so deeply into the fabric of culture and institutions that we often fail to notice how thoroughly they reshaped the world around them. The true story of such families rarely announces itself loudly. It unfolds through quiet decisions made in boardrooms, through the careful placement of money into channels that seem respectable and philanthropic, through the subtle interweaving of commerce and culture until they become nearly indistinguishable. If stories like this call to you, narratives that explore not the obvious villains of history, but rather the elaborate, intricate ways that fortunes are built, preserved, and sometimes ultimately challenged by the consequences of their own making, then you might consider subscribing to follow this documentary journey. Here, we move through the hidden dynasties of the world not as judgment, but as inquiry. Each narrative unfolds at a pace designed to let you absorb not just the facts, but the underlying architecture of how influence operates, how institutions absorb resources and complicity alike, and how the echoes of old decisions continue to reverberate through the present day. The story you're listening to now the story of the Sacklers, is one among many. It's a story about inheritance and ambition, about brothers who carried different visions for what they'd inherited, about a grandfather who arrived in America with nothing and whose descendants would eventually help shape the face of modern medicine itself. But it's also a story about how those same descendants would, across generations and in ways that sometimes seem disconnected from intention, contribute to one of the largest public health crises of the modern era. These are narratives that reward a slow, attentive listening. They require patience to unfold properly, because the forces that shape such stories rarely announce themselves in dramatic moments. Instead, they emerge through accumulated detail, through the small decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, through the ways that human ambition and institutional incentive can align in patterns that no single person necessarily intended. The Sackler story is a case in point. It is neither a simple tale of villainy nor a vindication of the family's intentions. It is something more complex and perhaps more instructive. A story about how a certain kind of power operates in America and what happens when the consequences of that power finally become impossible to contain. The documentary series we're constructing here, through these long night journeys into the hidden corners of global history, is built on a principle that might seem unusual for content designed to ease you towards sleep. It assumes that your mind, even as your body begins to release the tensions of the day, retains a hunger for depth. It assumes that the most restful kind of listening is not necessarily the lightest kind, but rather the kind that engages your curiosity in a way that allows your thoughts to settle into narrative rather than continuing to circle the anxieties of your own day. This is why we linger on these stories, why we don't rush through them to reach some neat conclusion. The Sackler family did not build its fortune through a single dramatic moment. The opioid crisis did not emerge from a single decision or a single drug. These things unfolded through decades, through countless smaller choices, through the way that money and prestige and institutional trust flowed together in patterns that seemed, at each individual moment, relatively unremarkable. Only when you pull back and look at the full arc does the picture become clear, and by then, the shape of it reveals something deeper about how power actually works in America. So as you settle further into this narrative, know that what you're about to encounter is not a simple morality tale. It is instead an invitation to understand complexity, to trace the genealogy of an idea from its inception to its consequences, to see how a family that positioned itself as patrons of beauty and healing became, in the eyes of millions, synonymous with one of the most devastating public health emergencies in American history. The journey from one to the other is the true story here, and it is a journey worth understanding in all its intricate detail. The Sackler family began, like so many American dynasties, with an arrival. They came from Eastern Europe in the early years of the 20th century, when immigration to America still represented a kind of possibility that most of the world could barely imagine. They came with ambition and with intelligence, with the hunger that often accompanies displacement, and with the belief that in America, the combination of education and effort could genuinely remake a life. The story of the Sackler fortune, like so many American stories, begins not in wealth, but in arrival. It begins in the early years of the 20th century, when a man named Isaac Sackler, a Jewish immigrant from Galicia, in what is now Ukraine, stepped off a ship into the vast and bewildering expanse of New York. He carried with him, as immigrants did, very little, some clothes, perhaps a photograph or two, and the kind of determination that comes from having nowhere else to go. It was around 1910, give or take a year or two, when Isaac and his wife Sophie settled into Brooklyn, that sprawling borough of tenements and small businesses and people speaking a dozen languages in the streets. Isaac found work as a pharmacist. This is the quiet detail from which everything else unfolds. Not a banker, not an industrialist, not someone who inherited a family name already laden with significance. a pharmacist. It was respectable work, essential work, the kind of profession that Jewish immigrants could access more readily than many others, and it situated Isaac within a world of medicine and commerce that would come to define his descendants. He was a man of modest means and steady habits, the kind of person who understood the value of knowledge and the careful management of other people's ailments. Brooklyn in those years was not yet the place it would become. It was still in the process of becoming, a place where a newcomer could establish himself through work and careful saving. Isaac and Sophie had 3 sons. There were no daughters, or if there were daughters, they remain peripheral to the narrative that history has chosen to preserve. These 3 boys, Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond, were born into a household where pharmacy was not merely a profession, but a kind of secular faith. The sons grew up in the shadow of their father's shop, in the rhythms of people coming to be healed, or at least to be helped, by the medicines he dispensed. They grew up in Brooklyn during the Depression, during a time when economic collapse was reshaping American life from the ground up. They were Jewish boys, in an America that did not always welcome Jewish ambition, and yet their father's success, modest as it was, showed them that such ambition was possible. Arthur, the eldest, was born in 1913. Even from early accounts, which are necessarily fragmentary and colored by the perspectives of those who wrote them, he emerges as the most intellectually restless of the 3. He was the one who seemed to sense, perhaps without quite knowing it, that there was a distance between selling a medicine and understanding how to make people want that medicine. He attended City College of New York, that institution of brilliant and hungry children whose families had little money but considerable aspirations. He moved through his studies with the kind of intensity that suggested he was trying to solve something beyond the mere requirements of a degree. Medicine fascinated him, yes, but so did the business of medicine, the machinery of persuasion that moved between the laboratory and the patient's hand. Mortimer and Raymond followed into the same general world, though on somewhat different trajectories. Mortimer, born in 1916, was the middle son, and there is a particular psychology that attaches to middle sons in ambitious families, is there not? A certain simultaneous hunger to prove oneself and awareness of the brother who came first. Raymond, born in 1920, was the youngest, and he entered a household already marked by success and aspiration. There was no memory in his early years of failure or poverty in any acute sense, though the Depression was pressing down on all of Brooklyn regardless of a particular family's circumstances. What is interesting to contemplate, in the careful way one approaches the lives of people before they became consequential, is how much was already latent in these family dynamics. 3 sons of an immigrant pharmacist. 3 boys who would have understood, from earliest childhood, the relationship between a chemical compound and human suffering. 3 boys who would have heard, at dinner tables and in pharmacy conversations, discussions of what people wanted, what they feared, what they might be willing to pay to feel better. This was not a family that viewed medicine cynically, necessarily. Rather, it was a family that understood, perhaps more intimately than most, that the delivery of medicine was also a kind of commerce, and that there was nothing shameful in the commerce as long as the medicine was real. Arthur completed his studies and moved into psychiatry. This was significant. In the 1930s and 1940s, psychiatry was a field of considerable uncertainty and considerable possibility. It was a field that was still being defined, that still had room for ambitious newcomers to reshape its boundaries. Arthur set himself up in New York, and he began to establish himself as a man who understood not just the clinical dimensions of psychiatric illness, but also the ways in which ideas about mental health could be conveyed to doctors, to the public, to the world at large. He was a natural networker, by all accounts. He had the kind of social ease that comes from genuine intellectual curiosity, and he seemed to understand instinctively that if you listened carefully to people, really listened, they would tell you what they needed. Mortimer, meanwhile, moved into the pharmaceutical side of the family enterprise more directly. He was, by accounts, quieter than Arthur, less inclined toward the grand gesture or the sweeping vision. He was a man of careful judgment and steady accumulation. He married and started a family early. He understood the value of stability and of being the reliable one, the one on whom others could depend. Raymond's path was different still. He too married young and began to build a life that seemed, in its broad strokes, quite ordinary. All three brothers, however, were drawn inexorably toward the family business, toward pharmacy, toward medicine, toward the space where human need and commercial opportunity intersected. By the end of the 1940s, the Sackler name was beginning to mean something in pharmaceutical circles, though it would take the next several decades for it to mean everything. The three brothers did not yet know what they would build together, nor could they have anticipated the trajectory their ambitions would trace across the latter half of the 20th century. They were simply the sons of an immigrant pharmacist, educated, ambitious, and ready to shape the world in which they lived. And perhaps that is always how such stories begin, not with a grand intention to transform an entire landscape, but with modest men in a modest city, seeing an opportunity and moving quietly, methodically toward it. Among the three Sackler brothers who inherited their parents' modest pharmaceutical ambitions, Arthur emerged as something altogether different. While Mortimer and Raymond would eventually command the business operations of Purdue Frederick, Arthur carved a path through the medical world itself, becoming the architect of an entirely new way of thinking about how drugs could be sold to doctors and, through them, to the American people. His story is less one of boardroom decisions than of a man who understood something few others grasped in the post-war years, that controlling the narrative around medicine was just as valuable as controlling the molecule itself. Arthur was born into a family already accustomed to the rhythms of pharmacy. Isaac and Sophie's immigrant enterprise had taught their sons that there was money in healing, or at least in the perception of it. But Arthur, perhaps more curious or more ambitious than his siblings, sought not to simply manufacture pills, but to understand the deeper machinery of how they moved through the medical system. In the 1940s, as he pursued his training in psychiatry at New York Hospital, he was entering a field experiencing its own kind of renaissance. Psychoanalysis had taken root in American consciousness. Freud had become almost a household name. The idea that the mind could be treated, that suffering could be chemically addressed, represented a frontier that coincided perfectly with post-war optimism and the American appetite for modern solutions to ancient problems. Psychiatry suited Arthur in ways that purely pharmaceutical manufacturing might not have. It gave him legitimacy within the medical establishment. It allowed him to wear the white coat of a doctor, to sit in consultation rooms, to understand from the inside how physicians thought and what they needed to hear. Those years of training were formative not merely for what they taught him about the mind, but for what they revealed about how medicine was actually practiced in America. Doctors, he began to understand, were not creatures of pure science. They were also readers of journals, listeners to sales representatives, observers of what their peers were doing. They were, in their way, creatures of persuasion and influence, just like anyone else. By the early 1950s, Arthur had begun to transition from clinical practice into something more entrepreneurial. He moved into medical publishing and advertising, working with pharmaceutical companies to shape how their products were presented to the medical world. This was the crucial pivot. Medical journals had become the primary conduit through which new drugs reached physicians' awareness. What if one could influence not just the advertisements within those journals, but the editorial environment itself? What if one could shape which studies were published, how they were framed, what conclusions they were encouraged to draw? Arthur founded his own medical advertising firm and began offering services to pharmaceutical companies that felt, to them, like pure enlightenment. He understood that doctors wanted to appear modern, scientifically current, attuned to the latest developments in pharmacology. Why not position a drug not as a chemical, but as a symbol of being on the frontier of medical knowledge? Why not make prescribing it an expression of a physician's own professional sophistication? It was marketing, certainly, but it was marketing that flattered itself against the language of science, that spoke in the careful cadence of peer review and evidence, even as the underlying agenda was entirely commercial. He began producing medical journals of his own, publications that looked and felt like legitimate scientific organs but were, in effect, sophisticated marketing vehicles. The Sackler Journal of Psychiatry, the Hospital Progress Journal. These were glossy, well-edited, impressively presented, and they all shared a curious property. They tended to emphasize pharmaceutical solutions to medical problems. Was this a conspiracy? It was something more insidious and less easily prosecuted. It was simply the natural result of a man who understood that the line between information and persuasion could be rendered almost invisible if one moved slowly enough and spoke with sufficient authority. Arthur also began consulting directly with major pharmaceutical companies, advising them on how to market their drugs more effectively. He worked with Roche on the promotion of Valium. He worked with other companies on a dizzying array of medications, and in doing so, he became something like the godfather of modern pharmaceutical advertising. Not the Madison Avenue kind, with jingles and slogans, but the subtle, physician-to-physician kind that felt like education rather than selling. He trained salespeople in the language of medicine. He taught them how to speak to doctors in a way that suggested they were all colleagues in the enterprise of healing, when in fact the entire infrastructure existed to move more pills. What made Arthur's contribution so remarkable was its effectiveness and its invisibility. Few people at the time had a name for what he was doing. There was no term yet for disease-mongering or ghostwriting, or the deliberate blurring of medical education and pharmaceutical marketing. These would become familiar concepts only decades later, when the harm had already been woven so deeply into the fabric of American medicine that it seemed inseparable from healing itself. Arthur was simply being clever, creative, enterprising. He was seeing an opportunity and seizing it. The post-war medical establishment, buoyant with confidence and funding, hungry for new treatments and new markets, was entirely receptive to what Arthur was offering. Psychiatry in particular was in the throes of a transformation. The older talk-based models of therapy were giving way to a chemical paradigm. Mental illness was increasingly understood, not as something you explored through conversation, but as something you corrected with medication. Arthur's work, his journals, his influence, all pushed in that direction. Was he the cause of this shift, or simply a shrewd observer who positioned himself perfectly at its moment of arrival? Perhaps the question itself misses the point. He was both. He understood the direction of the wind, and he helped it blow stronger. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, Arthur Sackler had accumulated considerable wealth and considerable influence. He had a seat at tables where the future of pharmaceuticals was being discussed. He had the ear of major medical institutions. He understood better than almost anyone how to make a drug seem necessary, modern, almost essential to the practice of good medicine. He had turned his psychiatrist's training and his family's pharmaceutical legacy into something genuinely innovative, a system for making people want to take drugs before they perhaps knew they needed them. The machinery was in place. All it needed was the right medication to push through it. It was in the early 1950s that the three brothers began to envision something larger than their individual pursuits. Arthur was already becoming influential in the world of medical publishing and psychiatric consultation, his name appearing in journals, his ideas shaping how doctors thought about mental illness. Mortimer had developed an interest in the pharmaceutical business itself, not merely as a subject to write about or study, but as a domain to control. And Raymond, the youngest, possessed an instinct for the commercial machinery that moves products from laboratory shelves into the hands of physicians. Between them lay an intuition that would prove both brilliant and, in hindsight, fateful. That the future of pharmaceutical wealth lay not in simply manufacturing good medicines, but in understanding how those medicines moved through the culture. The company they founded bore a modest name, Purdue Frederick. Named after a chemical process and a family ancestor, it carried no hint of the transformation it would eventually catalyze. In its earliest years, Purdue Frederick was a small, respectable pharmaceutical manufacturer in the American Midwest. It produced unremarkable but solid medications, laxatives, earwax removers, creams for skin conditions, practical things, the kind of medicines one might find on the shelves of a small-town drugstore, used by farmers and mothers and the elderly without much fanfare or particular expectation. But the brothers saw something others had missed. They understood, in a way that was still novel and unexamined in those post-war years, that the creation of a successful drug was only half the equation. The other half, the part that determined whether a medicine became legendary or remained obscure, was how you convinced the world it was necessary. They had watched Arthur navigate the corridors of medical publishing. They had observed how a well-placed article, a persuasive lecture at a medical conference, a friendly relationship with the right doctors could shift the perception of what physicians thought they knew, and they began to ask themselves, what if we could apply those same principles to our own products? What if marketing, in other words, could be reimagined not as something separate from medicine itself, but as an integral part of how medicine was understood and practiced? This was not a cynical observation, at least not in the way they likely experienced it. The brothers genuinely believed in pharmaceutical innovation. They believed that modern science had given humanity extraordinary tools to manage suffering, to extend life, to improve the quality of human experience. What they also believed, with equal conviction, was that belief itself was an asset to be cultivated. A medicine only works, after all, if a doctor prescribes it and a patient takes it. And for that to happen, both the physician and the public must be convinced of its necessity, its safety, its superiority over alternatives. The strategy they began to construct was patient and methodical. They hired sales representatives, young men in pressed suits, trained to visit physicians' offices and speak the language of modern medicine while distributing literature and samples. This was not unique to Purdue Frederick. Other pharmaceutical companies had done similar things, but the Sacklers elevated it into an art form. They were among the first to recognize that you could quantify persuasion, track it, refine it, optimize it. They gathered data on which doctors were most receptive to particular pitches. They created incentives. They understood that a physician who received frequent visits and small gifts and invitations to sponsored dinners and medical conferences would begin to think of your company not as a commercial entity, but as a partner in the shared enterprise of healing. Arthur, with his medical credentials and his connections within psychiatry, provided intellectual legitimacy to these efforts. He would publish papers, deliver lectures, lend his prestige to the idea that Purdue Frederick was not merely a manufacturer, but a steward of scientific progress. Mortimer and Raymond handled the machinery of production and distribution, the logistics that turned intention into market presence. Between them, they were building something more sophisticated than a pharmaceutical company. They were building an entire ecosystem of persuasion. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Purdue Frederick was flourishing in ways that surprised even its competitors. They were not the largest pharmaceutical manufacturer. They did not have the resources of giants like Merck or Eli Lilly, but they had something those companies had yet to fully appreciate. They had understood that in the modern age, the perception of a medicine could matter as much as the medicine itself. They had begun to blur, almost entirely, the line between the act of healing and the act of selling. And they were doing it with such grace, such apparent commitment to the scientific method, such confident alignment with the professional aspirations of physicians, that almost no one thought to question it. What they were developing, though the term would not become common until decades later, was a model of pharmaceutical marketing that treated doctors not as independent professionals making autonomous decisions based on clinical evidence, but as nodes in a network of influence that could be mapped, studied, and redirected. They understood that if you could shape what a physician believed about a drug's efficacy, about its safety profile, about the prevalence of the condition it treated, then you could shape prescribing patterns. And prescribing patterns, multiplied across thousands of physicians and millions of patients, transformed into market share, and market share transformed into the kind of wealth that built dynasties. The brothers were not hidden figures in this transformation. Arthur published. Mortimer and Raymond expanded the company's reach into new markets and new regions of the country. But there was a deliberateness to how they maintained a kind of distance between themselves and the more overtly commercial aspects of what was happening. Arthur was the doctor, the intellectual, the man who published research and sat on medical boards. The machinery of sales and marketing was run by others, by executives and representatives, whose names the broader public would never learn. And yet the vision came from the brothers themselves. The strategy was theirs. The understanding of how to fuse scientific authority with commercial ambition was their innovation, their contribution to American pharmaceutical culture. It is difficult, at this remove, to say with certainty whether the Sacklers fully grasped what they were setting in motion. They were not, in these early years, consciously plotting the mass addiction that would eventually flow from their enterprise. They were not explicitly aiming to create a drug so powerful and so effectively marketed that it would destroy lives by the hundreds of thousands. The evidence suggests something more complicated and perhaps more troubling. They understood, clearly and specifically, that they were building a system that could move products and generate profit, and they were content to allow that system to operate without sustained scrutiny into where it might lead. They were building, in other words, not a pharmaceutical company, but a machine for the industrialized manufacture of conviction, and they were very good at it. What Arthur Sackler understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else in his circle, was that selling medicine was not fundamentally different from selling anything else. The impulse seems almost obvious now, filtered through decades of pharmaceutical campaigns and direct-to-consumer advertisements that fill our screens. Yet, in the post-war years following 1945, this notion was genuinely radical. Doctors had been trained to think of themselves as scientists first, and business people never, and the pharmaceutical industry had largely respected this boundary, letting their products speak through the measured language of clinical trials and peer review. Arthur moved through this world and saw it differently. He saw an opportunity in the very gap between what doctors needed to know and how they learned it. He began, in the late 1940s and early 1950s, to recognize the untapped power of medical journals themselves. These publications, the New England Journal of Medicine, the Journal of the American Medical Association, publications that carried the weight of scientific authority and landed on the desks of thousands of practicing physicians, were repositories not just of knowledge, but of influence. Physicians trusted them. They read them in their offices between patients. They referenced them when making treatment decisions. And they were, in many ways, far more responsive to financial incentive than anyone had previously acknowledged. Arthur began placing pharmaceutical advertisements in these journals, yes, but he went further. He funded medical writing. He sponsored continuing education programs that hospitals and medical schools were required to provide to their practitioners. He helped establish new medical publications that filled specific niches, all while subtly orienting them toward pharmaceutical industry interests. It was a network of influence, quiet and invisible to the untrained eye, but consequential. The mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. A drug manufacturer would approach Arthur's various ventures. He had his fingers in many pies by now, with a new compound they wished to promote. Arthur would coordinate the placement of advertisements in medical journals, certainly, but he would also help craft the narrative around that drug. He would commission articles written by sympathetic physicians and academics, articles that would appear to be independent contributions from members of the medical establishment, but that carried messages the manufacturer had essentially scripted. These articles would emphasize the benefits of the drug, while minimizing or simply not mentioning its risks. They would create the impression that a consensus existed among physicians when often no such consensus had formed naturally. The articles would appear alongside advertisements for the same drug, creating a kind of circular reinforcement. A doctor would read what appeared to be objective scientific commentary on a medication, see an advertisement for that same medication, and naturally begin to think that other doctors must be using it, that it must be safe and effective, that it would be remiss not to consider it for their patients. What made this particularly insidious was the authority structure it exploited. Medical journals occupied a sacred space in the imagination of physicians. They were where truth lived, where the scientific method was on full display. Advertising was advertising, and doctors knew to maintain a certain skepticism toward it. But an article? A research finding? That was different. That was knowledge. By blurring the line between editorial content and marketing, Arthur was not simply selling drugs, he was colonizing the very epistemic space where doctors formed their understanding of medicine itself. And he did this with such sophistication, such careful orchestration, across multiple venues and through multiple intermediaries, that the full scope of it was not widely visible or discussed at the time. Some physicians and medical ethicists began to voice concern. There were quiet murmurs in academic circles about the increasing commercialization of medical knowledge, about the ways in which pharmaceutical companies seemed to have a hand in shaping what appeared in journals and what was taught in medical schools. But these concerns were often dismissed as naive or puritanical. This was how business worked, the argument went. This was how innovation was funded. Was it so wrong that companies wished to communicate the benefits of their products to the doctors who might use them? The alternative, silence, obscurity, a return to the old days when good medicines took decades to find their audience, seemed absurd. And in the broader optimism of post-war America, in an era when pharmaceutical companies had literally saved millions of lives through antibiotics and vaccines, skepticism about the industry seemed almost churlish. Arthur Sackler himself became something of a public figure in medical circles during these decades, though not the kind of public figure whose name appeared in newspapers. He was known to physicians and pharmaceutical executives, spoken of with a mixture of admiration and, by some, unease. He had a peculiar kind of power, the power to shape conversations that never appeared to have been shaped at all. He could make a particular understanding of a drug seem to emerge naturally from the medical community itself. He could make a pharmaceutical company's interests appear to align seamlessly with patient welfare. And he did all of this while maintaining an almost scholarly demeanor, presenting himself as a facilitator of knowledge rather than a designer of persuasion. There is something psychologically compelling about the way Arthur managed his role. He was not a charlatan in his own mind. He genuinely believed in the efficacy of modern medicine. He had trained as a psychiatrist. He had worked in psychiatric hospitals. He had seen genuine suffering and the genuine relief that medication could provide. When he promoted a new drug, he could persuade himself that he was helping to ensure that beneficial medicines reached the physicians and patients who needed them. The fact that he was simultaneously helping the manufacturer maximize profits, and that these two aims might not always be perfectly aligned, could be cordoned off in the mind, treated as a secondary consideration, or not acknowledged at all. This is how people tend to justify involvement in systems that others might regard as fundamentally compromised. They focus on the genuine good that the system sometimes produces, and maintain a kind of willful inattention to its corrupting mechanisms. Yet the historical record shows that Arthur was conscious, at some level, of what he was doing. He understood the mechanics of persuasion. He understood, perhaps more clearly than most, the difference between informing someone and convincing them, and he chose persuasion. He chose to orient his considerable gifts, his intelligence, his sophistication, his understanding of both medicine and marketing, toward the project of making physicians want to prescribe certain drugs. He built a career on the premise that medicine could be sold like anything else, and he built it well. The pharmaceutical industry would follow the path he had helped to lay out. The marriage of advertising and medical authority would only grow stronger in the decades to come, until the distinction between the two became almost meaningless. It was in the early 1950s, as the post-war world settled into a peculiar kind of anxiety, that Arthur Sackler began to understand something fundamental about the American mind. The country had emerged victorious from global conflict, yet prosperity brought with it a new, quieter dread. Women felt it in their bones as they managed households and suppressed ambitions. Men felt it in the spaces between work and home, and what came to be called the Age of Anxiety found its perfect chemical answer in a drug that would transform Arthur Sackler's understanding of what a pharmaceutical company could be. Benzodiazepines were not, by any measure, a Sackler invention. A Swiss laboratory had synthesized the first compound, chlordiazepoxide, and by 1960, a new benzodiazepine called diazepam, to be known to the world as Valium, was released onto the market. But if Valium was not born from Purdue Frederick's research division, it was Arthur Sackler who grasped, with almost prophetic clarity, how to make it speak to the American condition. Here, at last, was a drug that could transform the intangible into the treatable. Anxiety, that murky inheritance of the modern age, could now be named, classified, medicated. The marketing strategy Arthur devised was, in retrospect, the blueprint for everything that would follow in pharmaceutical promotion for decades to come. He did not simply advertise Valium to doctors. Instead, he created a whole ecosystem of medical education around the drug, one so seamless that it became difficult to distinguish between genuine scientific inquiry and sophisticated salesmanship. In the pages of medical journals, which Arthur had grown so skilled at shaping through his publishing empire, Valium began to appear not as a new commodity, but as the answer to a profound medical question. Consider the texture of this moment. Doctors were being educated through symposiums sponsored by the drug's manufacturers. Medical literature suddenly bloomed with articles exploring the connections between anxiety and disease, between emotional distress and physical symptom. These articles were not, strictly speaking, dishonest. They were simply selective in what they emphasized, generous in what they suggested, careful in what they left unspoken. A doctor reading these materials would come away convinced, through an almost unconscious process, that Valium was not merely one option among many, but rather the natural, obvious response to a patient's suffering. This is where Arthur Sackler's genius lay. He understood that pharmaceutical marketing could work not through crude persuasion, but through the creation of consensus. If enough respected medical voices could be made to speak about Valium in a particular way, if enough journals published studies conducted by researchers with subtle financial ties to the manufacturer, if enough physicians came to believe, genuinely believe, that they were prescribing based on science rather than marketing, then the line between truth and persuasion would dissolve entirely. The doctor would become, unknowingly, the drug company's most credible voice. Throughout the 1960s and into the 70s, Valium became not just a pharmaceutical success, but a cultural phenomenon. It was prescribed so widely, to so many kinds of patients, for so many different conditions, that it came to represent something almost mythical in American medicine. A mother struggling with the demands of motherhood could find relief. A businessman overwhelmed by his ambitions could find calm. A woman experiencing the aging process could find a pharmaceutical answer to an existential question. The drug was everywhere. It was the most prescribed medication in the country, and for a time, some years, it was the single most profitable drug in the world. But beneath this success lay something subtler and more consequential than mere commercial triumph. What Arthur Sackler had accomplished was the creation of pharmaceutical trust. By carefully orchestrating the appearance of scientific consensus, by blurring the boundaries between education and marketing, by making doctors feel they were exercising independent medical judgment when they were, in fact, being guided down a path prepared long before by corporate strategy, he had established a template for how a drug company could achieve something more valuable than profit: credibility. The patients who took Valium believed their doctors. The doctors believed the medical literature. The medical literature had been shaped by pharmaceutical interests. Yet at no point in this chain was anyone technically lying. The drug did work for some conditions. The side effects were not always mentioned prominently, but they were mentioned. The dangers of long-term use and dependency were not widely emphasized, but there were hints of them in medical journals for those who cared to look. What Arthur Sackler had discovered was that you did not need to deceive people if you could control the flow of information, shape the conversation, and make certain truths harder to see than others. Think for a moment about what this meant for the pharmaceutical industry as a whole. If a company could use marketing to establish credibility, if it could turn its own interests into what appeared to be objective medical knowledge, then the door was open to something unprecedented. A pharmaceutical company was no longer merely selling products, it was selling permission. It was teaching doctors how to think about disease. It was shaping the language that patients use to understand their own suffering. And yet, at the time, this seemed entirely benign. Valium was not heroin. It was not addictive in the way cocaine was addictive, or so people believed. The dependence that developed in some long-term users was understood to be different, psychological perhaps, or simply the natural consequence of taking a drug for a chronic condition. If some patients found it difficult to stop taking Valium, well, that was a reflection of the ongoing nature of their anxiety, was it not? The drug itself was safe. Science had said so. The medical journals had confirmed it. Doctors prescribed it with confidence. In quiet rooms across America, people were becoming dependent on Valium without quite understanding how it had happened. The dependence was gentle, invisible. It did not announce itself as addiction. It wore the respectable mask of medical treatment. A woman who could not imagine starting her day without her morning pill was not a patient with a drug problem. She was a patient whose anxiety required ongoing pharmaceutical management. This distinction, this subtle linguistic shift, was part of what Arthur Sackler had made possible. He died in 1987, still a young man, still brilliant, still accumulating art and donating it to museums that would bear his name. He never saw OxyContin. He never witnessed the crisis that his methodologies would help enable, but his fingerprints were all over the machinery that would eventually transform American medicine into something far darker than anyone in the hopeful 1960s could have imagined. The seeds he had planted in how a pharmaceutical company could speak to doctors, how it could build trust, how it could shape medical consensus, those seeds were patient, they were waiting, and they would grow in soil fertilized by opioid pain management, where the stakes would be far higher and the consequences far more terrible than anything Valium, for all its complications, had ever caused. In the years after Arthur's death, his brothers Mortimer and Raymond inherited not just a company, but a system. They had learned the lesson Arthur had taught so well, that modern medicine offered boundless opportunities for those who understood how to market not drugs, but certainty itself. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, while the broader machinations of Purdue Pharma continued to hum quietly in the background, a company growing richer on each prescription written, each medical journal advertisement placed, each physician influenced through careful incentive structures, the Sackler family itself had begun a curious transformation. They were no longer simply businessmen, though the business remained their foundation. They were becoming something else, something that required a different kind of visibility, a different relationship to their own wealth. They were becoming philanthropists. The accumulation had been steady and almost unremarkable in its constancy. Purdue's profits flowed upward in predictable streams, distributed among the various family trusts and holding companies, splitting between Arthur's branch and the interests of Mortimer and Raymond. By some estimates, the company was generating hundreds of millions annually, and yet to most Americans, Purdue Pharma remained nearly invisible. A name on a pill bottle, perhaps, but not a household word, not a brand that children would recognize or that evening news anchors would speak aloud. This anonymity was, perhaps, entirely intentional. Wealth accumulates most comfortably in shadow. But the family itself could not remain in shadow. Not entirely. There was something about vast fortune that seemed to demand a kind of presentation, a way of announcing itself to the world that transcended crude displays of consumption. The Sacklers understood, whether through instinct or through careful family guidance, that in post-war America, culture had become the acceptable currency of legacy. A building could be named, a wing could be endowed, a collection could be assembled and donated, and in doing so, one's name would be inscribed not in the ledgers of commerce, which most people never see, but in spaces where millions of people walked, where children on school trips pressed their faces against glass cases, where researchers and artists spent their careers surrounded by the patronage of the family whose name appeared on the plaques. Arthur Sackler, ever the sophisticated operator, had grasped this first. Beyond his pharmaceutical interests, beyond his medical journals and his advertising innovations, Arthur had begun collecting art, not haphazardly, not as a wealthy man's idle hobby, but with the same systematic precision he had brought to everything else in his life. He acquired pieces, ancient Asian artifacts, works of significant historical and monetary value, with the deliberate intention of eventually placing them somewhere permanent, somewhere that would outlast him, somewhere that would bear his name. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York became the primary canvas for this vision. In 1987, Arthur made a significant commitment to the museum, a donation that would result in the creation of the Arthur M. Sackler Wing. It was announced with appropriate ceremony and gratitude. Museum directors praised his generosity, his vision, his understanding of the role that cultural institutions must play in the life of a great city. And Arthur's name, inscribed on the wing, became synonymous with art appreciation, with the preservation of human civilization, with beauty and knowledge and the finer things that money, at its best, could protect and share. This was not, of course, unusual. Wealthy families had been naming buildings after themselves for centuries. The practice was so normalized, so thoroughly woven into the institutional fabric of American culture, that it scarcely warranted comment. A donation was made, a name was inscribed. Everyone moved forward. Yet there was something worth noticing in the particular timing of this, in the particular choice of venue. As Purdue Pharma's influence grew, as its products became more deeply embedded in American medicine, as its marketing machinery became ever more sophisticated in its ability to shape physician behavior and patient expectation, Arthur Sackler was simultaneously becoming the face of cultural stewardship, of taste, of the kind of patron who ensures that future generations would have access to the best that human civilization had produced. The psychological weight of this should not be underestimated. When someone walks through a museum wing bearing a name, when they see that name inscribed in brass or stone, something happens in their mind. They make an association between the name and the space, between the person and the institution. In time, the association becomes nearly inseparable. The Sackler name began to appear in contexts of beauty, of scholarship, of civilization itself, the Metropolitan, the British Museum, the Smithsonian, museums in universities across the country. Each donation, each naming opportunity, created another anchor point, another place where the family's identity would be woven into the fabric of how people understood culture and legacy. And yet, Arthur Sackler died in 1987, just as these plans were coming to fruition. He died suddenly, at the age of 73, before he could fully see the constellation of institutions bearing his name, before the full architecture of his philanthropic vision could materialize. But the vision survived him. The donations continued, the buildings were built, the wings were named, and the Sackler family, now under the guidance of Mortimer and Raymond and their respective branches, understood very clearly what Arthur had understood, that wealth, if managed carefully, could be transformed into a kind of cultural immortality. Consider the strange alchemy of this transformation, a fortune made through the careful marketing of pharmaceuticals, through influencing how doctors prescribed, through understanding the vulnerabilities of human psychology and the mechanisms of human persuasion. This fortune could be cleaned, in a manner of speaking, and redeposited into the world as art, as culture, as the kind of legacy that scholars would study and tourists would visit. Museums, it turned out, were not merely repositories of art and history. They were also, whether knowingly or not, repositories of the narratives that wealthy families wished to tell about themselves. The Sackler fortune was not simply being accumulated and hidden away. It was being transformed into visibility, but visibility of a particular kind, not the visibility of ledgers and financial disclosures, but the visibility of one's name etched into the architecture of civilization itself. And as the 1980s turned toward the 1990s, as Purdue Pharma prepared to introduce a new product that would generate profits beyond anything the family had previously imagined, this apparatus of cultural patronage was already in place, already doing its quiet work of reshaping how the Sackler name would be perceived and remembered. The irony of this, if one were inclined to notice such things, was that the more the family gave to museums, the more plausible it became to imagine them as benefactors rather than business people, as guardians of civilization rather than architects of an approaching crisis. But in the sleep-dark hours, in the spaces between waking and dreaming, such paradoxes often go unexamined. They are simply the texture of the world as it is, the ordinary functioning of how power and wealth and legacy are negotiated in a society that has learned, over centuries, to accept almost any contradiction as long as it is dressed in the language of culture and generosity. There exists a peculiar architecture within the world of major institutions, museums, universities, concert halls, wings of hospitals, where the source of wealth and the use of that wealth exist in two separate chambers, rarely required to meet. And this separation, this comfortable distance, became almost a kind of institutional design, a blueprint for how money could move from one hand to another without the heaviness of its origins traveling with it. The Sackler name began appearing on buildings in the 1970s and 1980s with increasing frequency, not in small discrete plaques, on major galleries, on entire wings. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York bore the Sackler name. The Smithsonian Institution held a Sackler gallery. Universities across America, from Yale to Princeton to the University of Pennsylvania, found themselves suddenly enriched by Sackler donations, running into the tens and then hundreds of millions of dollars. And there is something worth sitting with here, something that psychologists and sociologists have long understood about the nature of philanthropy and institutional behavior. When a major institution receives a transformative gift of money, something shifts in how that institution perceives the giver. The neurons don't fire the same way. The mind doesn't interrogate with the same rigor. A donor who arrives with enormous resources is seen, almost neurologically, as successful, as trustworthy, as someone whose judgment has been validated by the market itself. And the institution, in return, experiences a genuine form of gratitude. This is not cynicism, it is human nature. The brain genuinely struggles to hold two opposing ideas in mind simultaneously, that a person is both brilliant and wealthy, and also potentially harmful, so it often chooses the former. Consider the psychological phenomenon, sometimes called the halo effect. When someone succeeds spectacularly in one domain, in the Sackler's case, pharmaceuticals and business, we unconsciously assume competence and virtue in other domains. The same mind that built a pharmaceutical company seems, almost by logical necessity, capable of caring about art, about culture, about the betterment of human experience. And there is often truth in this. Many wealthy patrons of the arts are thoughtful, complicated people, genuinely committed to preserving beauty. But the halo effect operates independent of truth. It operates as a kind of intellectual shortcut the mind takes to manage overwhelming information. Museums and universities, for all their sophistication, are also institutions filled with people who experience the same cognitive biases as everyone else. The director of a major museum who is offered a donation large enough to fund the construction of a new gallery or to expand an existing wing experiences a very real form of vindication. Here is external validation that her vision is important, that her institution matters, that culture itself is being preserved because of her leadership. This is not a small thing, and in that moment of validation, the question of who the money came from and how they obtained it can drift into the softer regions of consciousness. It becomes a detail, necessary perhaps for due diligence, but not necessary for the feeling of success. Institutional memory is also remarkably short. A curator or administrator who takes a Sackler donation in 1985 may not, in 2015, be the same person making decisions about that institution. The young museum director of that era has retired or moved to another museum. The people who approved the gift are gone. The institution itself develops a kind of mythologized version of its own past. The Sackler wing exists. It has existed long enough to feel permanent, to feel like it has always been there. And the story of its creation, who gave the money, when, under what circumstances, becomes historical. Something that happened long ago, something resolved. There is also a deeper psychological mechanism at work, one that researchers in moral psychology have documented repeatedly. We tend to separate the identity of the giver from the gift itself. Once a donation has been made, once money has changed hands, there is a psychological relief. The transaction is complete. We possess something of value, a building, an endowment, a collection, and we own it now, independent of its origins. The gift becomes separate from the giver. This process is not unique to the Sacklers. It is how philanthropy works across society. But it becomes particularly significant when the source of the wealth is morally complex or ultimately revealed to be harmful. The Sacklers understood this, perhaps not consciously, but understood it nonetheless through the logic of power and influence. Wealth, when given away in the right way, becomes purified, transformed. A fortune made through aggressive pharmaceutical marketing becomes, through the alchemy of institutional naming, a force for cultural preservation, for the advancement of knowledge, for beauty. This is not to suggest the Sacklers cynically calculated this outcome, though we cannot know what conversations happened behind closed doors. Rather, it is to recognize that they were operating within a system that was almost designed to accept their money without interrogation. Universities, particularly, operate under a principle that might be called epistemological humility. They are institutions built on the idea that knowledge is paramount, that truth emerges through research and dialogue, and that the pursuit of understanding is elevated above almost all other concerns. When a university accepts a major donation, it does so partly in faith that the donor's wealth reflects some kind of legitimate success, faith that accepting the money does not compromise the institution's ability to pursue truth, And for many donors, this faith is justified. But the psychological mechanism remains constant. Major gifts create a kind of gravitational field around the giver. The institution orbits, subtly, toward the donor's interests and reputation. Museum curators, too, operate with a kind of professional faith that great art, great cultural preservation, depends on private wealth. That without donors, many of the world's most important collections would not survive. This is historically accurate. Countless treasures exist because wealthy individuals chose to fund their preservation. So when a major gift arrives, there is gratitude mixed with a kind of philosophical resignation. This is how culture survives in capitalist societies. Private wealth must be mobilized in service of public good. The system requires it. And perhaps the system works well enough that we can afford to be somewhat incurious about the origins of individual fortunes. By the 1980s and 1990s, the Sackler name had become genuinely prestigious through sheer repetition and institutional affiliation. The name appeared in contexts of acknowledged excellence. The Met, Yale, Princeton. These are not casual associations. They carry weight. And over time, the name itself became dissociated from the family's business interests. When a museum director or university president encountered the name Sackler, the primary associations were not pharmaceutical marketing or aggressive profit-seeking. They were cultural sophistication, commitment to the arts, refined taste. This is the strange alchemy of philanthropy. It is also, in some respects, the intended mechanism. Major gifts are designed to reshape perception, to create a narrative, to establish a legacy that exists separate from the daily operations of the enterprise that generated the wealth. And there is something almost gentle about how this happens. There is no conspiracy, no explicit bargain. Institutions do not sit down and agree to willfully ignore uncomfortable truths in exchange for donations. Rather, the psychology of philanthropy itself creates a kind of protective space. Money large enough and strategic enough becomes, almost by definition, money that should be accepted and celebrated. The institution that refuses a transformative gift must have serious grounds, and those grounds must be not merely moral concerns, but something more substantial: a lawsuit, a conviction, hard evidence of direct harm. In the decades before OxyContin became a national crisis, the Sackler family had none of these. They had, instead, a reputation as successful business people and patrons of culture. That was enough. The museums and universities that bear the Sackler name did not fail in any obvious way. They did not commit any recognizable transgression. They operated precisely according to how institutions in capitalist societies are designed to operate. They accepted major gifts. They built buildings. They created endowments that allowed for scholarships and exhibitions and programs that genuinely enriched lives. The fact that those same gift givers were simultaneously engineering a pharmaceutical business model that would ultimately contribute to one of the greatest public health crises in American history, that fact existed, during these decades, in a parallel reality, one that the institutions did not see, or rather, one that they were psychologically structured not to see, even if the information was theoretically available. This is not an indictment of museums and universities. It is, rather, a recognition of how institutions, like individuals, navigate moral complexity, how they manage cognitive dissonance, how they accept the benefits of a system while remaining somewhat willfully incurious about its mechanisms. And it is perhaps a meditation on how easily the names of institutions can be claimed, how a wing, a gallery, a collection can bear a family name, and that name can gradually become synonymous with the institution itself, losing its connection to the actual people who gave the money and the actual ways they obtained it. The separation was almost perfect during those years. On one side of the wall, in museum galleries lit by careful lighting, under ceilings that echoed with footsteps. Visitors could stand in front of paintings and sculptures and experience beauty. And above those works hung the Sackler name. On the other side of the wall, in pharmaceutical offices, in sales meetings, in boardrooms where strategies were developed and executed, a different story was being written. A story about how pain could be marketed, how reluctant doctors could be persuaded to prescribe opioids more liberally, how profit and pharmaceuticals could be woven together into a vast enterprise. These two realities barely intersected in the minds of most people. They existed in different cultural narratives. One was about beauty, one was about business, and institutions, through their psychology and their structure, allowed both stories to be true without requiring them to speak to each other. Arthur Sackler died on May 26, 1987, in a Manhattan hospital at the age of 73. He had been suffering from heart disease for some time, a condition that seemed almost inevitable given the pace at which he'd lived his entire adult life, always moving, always calculating, always reaching for the next acquisition, the next partnership, the next way to reshape how medicine itself was presented to the world. His funeral was attended by physicians, publishers, museum directors, and business associates whose names appeared in the society pages of New York newspapers. Yet there was something curiously muted about his passing. The empire he had constructed during those prolific post-war decades, the pharmaceutical consultancy, the medical publishing interests, the advertising innovations that had taught an entire generation of doctors to think of medications as carefully branded products, was far less visible than his art collection or his museum donations. In the days following his death, those close to him found themselves asking a question that would echo much more loudly decades later. What happens to an enterprise built so entirely around one man's vision, one man's restless appetite for control and influence? Arthur had been the brilliant architect, the strategist who understood that power in the pharmaceutical world didn't necessarily come from inventing molecules, but from shaping the stories that surrounded them. His brothers, Mortimer and Raymond, had grown wealthy alongside him, certainly. They had participated in the building of Purdue Frederick. They understood the business. But Arthur had always been the one who saw further ahead, who grasped the psychological machinery beneath commerce. What follows is perhaps a quieter transition than one might expect from such a consequential story. There was no dramatic struggle for control. There were no public disputes or family ruptures that made their way into the business press. Instead, what happened was gradual, almost mechanical in its precision. The company that would eventually become Purdue Pharma, or rather, the pharmaceutical operations that would eventually become that company, simply continued forward under different hands. It is perhaps this very smoothness, this absence of visible friction, that allowed the most significant transformation to occur largely without public awareness. Raymond Sackler and his wife Beverly had always maintained a somewhat lower profile than Arthur. They were the collectors too, the philanthropists, but their fortune seemed primarily to flow through Purdue Frederick, where Raymond had developed a genuine interest in the pharmaceutical business itself. He was less the visionary and more the operator, someone who understood distribution, who grasped the importance of relationships with wholesalers and pharmacy chains, who could navigate the regulatory landscape with the careful attention of someone who had actually studied it. Mortimer and Teresa, his wife, cultivated a similar kind of quietness. They too were donors to museums and universities. They too were building a legacy through carefully placed gifts. But the direction of Purdue Pharma, the shape it would take in the years to come, would rest increasingly with Raymond's branch of the family, at least in its operational decisions. What is worth noting, and what historians and investigators would later scrutinize with considerable intensity, is that Arthur had already set something in motion before he died. His vision for pharmaceutical marketing, the idea that you could create demand for treatments by shaping how doctors understood disease itself, by positioning medications as modern solutions to timeless human problems, had become almost institutional within Purdue Frederick. The people he had hired, the consultants he had cultivated, the relationships he had built with medical journals and medical schools, all of this persisted. It was as if Arthur had created a kind of invisible architecture that would continue to exert influence long after he himself was gone. The late 1980s and early 1990s, in the years immediately following Arthur's death, were not particularly eventful for Purdue Frederick from a public perspective. The company continued to produce its portfolio of medications. It continued to develop new formulations and to market them to physicians with the same careful sophistication that had characterized Arthur's approach. But the company was, in a real sense, waiting. It was waiting for the right moment, the right product, the right cultural context in which to deploy the full machinery of modern pharmaceutical marketing once again. The foundation was there, the expertise was there, the regulatory pathways were becoming clearer. All that was needed was a new molecule, a new promise. It is worth pausing here to consider what Arthur Sackler's death meant in symbolic terms, even as we acknowledge that symbols and historical narratives can sometimes mislead us. In one reading, his passing represented the end of an era, the post-war moment when pharmaceutical companies were still figuring out how to market in a newly regulated landscape, when the boundary between education and promotion was still being drawn and redrawn. The Valium years, the era when tranquilizers seemed to promise a chemical solution to the anxieties of modern life, were themselves fading into something more complicated, more contested. Doctors and patients alike were becoming more skeptical of pharmaceutical solutions to everyday unhappiness. The pendulum, it seemed, might be swinging back. Yet in another reading, and this is the one that, with the benefit of hindsight, seems more prophetic, Arthur's death represented a transition rather than an ending. The company would soon be positioned to release a medication that would dwarf even Arthur's greatest marketing successes. The pharmaceutical sales representatives would become more numerous, more sophisticated, more systematically trained in the art of persuasion. The relationships with doctors would deepen and become more transactional. The targeting of diseases, the careful construction of medical need would reach heights that even Arthur, visionary though he was, might not have fully imagined. His death, then, was not an ending, but a handoff. The baton was being passed to brothers who had learned well from his example, and the stage was being set for something unprecedented in scale. Mortimer and Raymond Sackler, in the years following Arthur's death, made few dramatic changes to the direction of the company. They were, by most accounts, more cautious than Arthur had been, more attentive to the bottom line in a conventional sense, less interested in pushing the boundaries of what pharmaceutical companies could claim or how aggressively they could pursue physicians as partners in selling drugs. But they were also the inheritors of a system, a legacy of knowledge about how to market medications effectively, and they were positioned within a company that had the resources and the expertise to deploy that knowledge at scale. The question that would eventually become urgent, the question of whether the family recognized the dangers inherent in the machine they had inherited, would remain, at this moment, still unasked in any serious way. Raymond Sackler, in particular, became the public face of Purdue Pharma in these years. He was the one who would make decisions about new products, about expansion into new markets, about how aggressively the company would pursue growth. He was a businessman of considerable competence by all accounts, but he was not an innovator in the way Arthur had been. He was someone who could execute a vision, not someone who necessarily questioned whether that vision was wise. And the vision that he inherited, the one that Arthur had spent decades constructing, was fundamentally about finding new ways to make people need medicines, finding new diseases to treat, finding new doctors to persuade that their patients required pharmaceutical intervention. In this sense, the transition was both a passing and a continuation. The company would move forward into a new era, with different faces at its head, but with the same underlying logic, the same fundamental strategies, the same faith in the power of marketing to shape medical practice. The philosophy of Arthur Sackler, that control over the narrative around a disease or a symptom could be more valuable than control over the molecule itself, would persist and, in the years to come, would be applied with even greater sophistication to the problem that would define an era, the treatment of chronic pain. By the time the 1980s drew to a close, and the 1990s emerged with their own particular anxieties, America had developed a peculiar relationship with pain, not with physical suffering itself, but with the idea that pain could be managed, that it need not be endured, that relief was not merely a comfort, but perhaps something closer to a right. This shift in thinking had been quietly taking shape for decades, gathering momentum through medical schools and hospital conferences, through television advertisements, and the careful conversations between physicians and their patients. And by the early 1990s, this cultural permission to seek relief from pain had grown into something far more expansive than it had ever been before. Consider what had transpired in the years leading up to this moment. The Vietnam War had created a generation of men returning home with chronic pain, with wounds that would not heal cleanly, with damage that required not weeks of recovery but years, sometimes a lifetime of management. The pharmaceutical industry, watching these vast populations of suffering, had begun to understand that pain itself was becoming a market. If a drug could relieve it safely, that drug could reach millions. The profit potential was almost unimaginable. And so, gradually, the stigma around opioid use began to soften in medical discourse, at least among certain circles of physicians who specialized in oncology, who worked with cancer patients for whom morphine had long been the only mercy available. But something deeper was also happening in the American consciousness. The late 20th century had brought with it a certain impatience with suffering. Modern medicine, in the popular imagination, had solutions for nearly everything. Why should a person endure migraines when triptans existed? Why bear depression when SSRIs could lift the fog? Why live with arthritis pain when something stronger could be prescribed? The expectation that medicine should alleviate not just life-threatening illness, but the minor miseries of daily existence had taken root, and pain, previously understood as an inevitable part of the human condition, began to be reframed as a symptom that deserved treatment, a sign that something could be done. In the medical literature, a subtle but significant turn was also underway. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, pain specialists and researchers were pushing back against what they saw as an outdated fear of opioids. The traditional medical establishment had long taught caution around narcotic medications, had instilled in generations of doctors a wariness about creating addiction, a fear that had sometimes meant withholding pain relief from patients who desperately needed it. But a growing chorus of voices in academic medicine began arguing that this caution had gone too far, that the risk of addiction from opioids, when properly prescribed for legitimate pain, had been exaggerated. Does this resonate as a reasonable medical argument? In many ways, it did. There was truth buried in these claims. Patients in genuine pain, receiving appropriate doses of medication under medical supervision, did not typically become addicted at the rates that street users or those with underlying addiction vulnerabilities did. Yet embedded within this emerging consensus was an assumption that would prove consequential. It assumed that the line between medical use and misuse could remain sharply drawn, that patients would take their medications as prescribed, that doctors would know their patients well enough to spot early signs of problematic use, that the healthcare system itself was robust enough to catch people when they began to slip. These assumptions would hold steady, if at all, only under very particular conditions. And by the 1990s, those conditions were already beginning to fray. The American healthcare system had undergone its own profound transformation. The The rise of insurance-based medicine, the consolidation of practices into larger systems, the increasing pressure to see more patients in less time. All of this meant that the intimate, ongoing relationship between doctor and patient, the kind that might have allowed for careful observation of developing problems, was becoming rarer. A patient might see a specialist for their arthritis pain, a different physician for back trouble, and still another for post-surgical discomfort. No single doctor had a complete picture, and the prescribing of opioids, once concentrated among specialists and pain centers, was beginning to migrate into general practice, into urgent care clinics, into the routines of family medicine. It was also during this period that the American Medical Association and various pain management societies began issuing position papers about what they termed pain as the fifth vital sign. The concept itself was reasonable, that pain should be assessed and treated with the same attention given to temperature, blood pressure, heart rate, and respiration. But in practice, this principle, when filtered through insurance company metrics and hospital quality improvement programs, created an incentive structure that often meant measure patient satisfaction with pain control, and doctors whose patients reported high pain levels would be marked as providing inadequate care. Who would have anticipated that this well-intentioned framework would eventually become one of the pressures pushing physicians toward opioid prescribing? The logic seemed to move almost inevitably forward, guided less by conscious choice than by systems designed to reward certain behaviors. Culturally, too, the 1990s carried their own mythology about pain and relief. This was the era of expanding expectations, of the idea that life could be optimized, that discomfort could be engineered away. Marketing had begun to work on the notion that relief was not just available but deserved, that pursuing comfort was not indulgence but self-care. A person suffering from chronic pain, watching these messages, receiving them from their friends and from the media they consumed, might reasonably come to believe that seeking medication to manage that pain was not only acceptable but appropriate, even virtuous. And into this landscape, one where medical opinion was shifting toward greater acceptance of opioids, where economic incentives were beginning to reward opioid prescribing, where cultural narratives were celebrating the elimination of discomfort, and where the healthcare system itself was fragmenting in ways that made careful monitoring difficult, there emerged a particular opportunity. What if a pharmaceutical company could take advantage of this moment? What if they could craft a drug that spoke to these currents, that positioned itself not as an old narcotic with old risks, but as a new solution to pain, safe and time-released, a modern answer to an ancient problem? By the early 1990s, the stage was almost perfectly set. In the early 1990s, as the Sackler family's wealth had settled into the quiet corners of museum wings and university endowments, a team of chemists and pharmaceutical researchers at Purdue Frederick were working on a problem that seemed, at the time, like an elegant solution waiting to be found. Pain management, they understood, was one of medicine's oldest failures. Patients with chronic conditions, those suffering from back injuries, arthritis, cancer, post-surgical discomfort, were caught in a painful bind. The opioids available to them were powerful, yes, but they required frequent dosing. Every few hours, the medication would wear off, and the pain would surge back, leaving the patient caught in a cycle of relief and suffering, a rhythm as old as medicine itself. What if, the researchers wondered, there existed a way to stretch a single dose of medication across an entire day, delivering steady, unbroken comfort without the peaks and valleys of traditional painkillers? What if the patient could simply take a pill in the morning and move through their day in stable, sustained relief? This was not a new idea, precisely. The technology of time-release medication, the ability to coat a drug so it dissolved slowly through the digestive system rather than all at once, had existed for decades. But in 1996, Purdue Frederick scientists developed what they believed was a refinement, a formulation that could hold oxycodone, a semi-synthetic opioid related to morphine, in a special polymer matrix. This polymer would dissolve gradually, releasing the medication hour after hour, creating what the company called a controlled-release tablet. They named it OxyContin. The name itself carried a sense of promise. Oxy for oxygen, for life, for vitality, and contin for continuous, for endlessness, for the unbroken peace that patients longed for. In the language of branding, the name whispered what the marketing would soon proclaim: this drug could make pain continuous-free. Before OxyContin could reach a single patient, it needed what the pharmaceutical industry calls approval, a journey through the Food and Drug Administration that typically takes years of clinical trials, safety monitoring, and rigorous scrutiny. But the FDA, facing its own pressures and constraints in the mid-1990s, expedited the review. The trials that supported OxyContin's approval were remarkably brief, many lasting only a few weeks, far shorter than the trials that had preceded earlier opioid medications. The data suggested the drug was safe, that the time-release mechanism prevented the rapid highs and lows that made other opioids prone to abuse. There was a logic to this reasoning. If the drug released slowly into the bloodstream, wouldn't it be harder to crush and snort, harder to inject, less likely to produce the rush that users sought? This became the cornerstone of Purdue's safety argument. This was the promise written into the very chemistry of the pill. The FDA approved OxyContin for pain relief in 1996, but approval was only the beginning. A drug approved is not a drug prescribed. Doctors needed to know about it. Patients needed to demand it. The pharmacy shelves needed to stock it. And so Purdue Frederick, now under the leadership of Mortimer Sackler's son Richard and the wider Sackler cousins, turned its attention to the art of persuasion, to the machinery of pharmaceutical marketing that Arthur Sackler had spent his life perfecting decades before. The sales force that Purdue assembled was enormous and intensely trained. Across the country, hundreds of representatives, many of them young, attractive, energetic, began making visits to doctors' offices, carrying with them free samples, branded gifts, and most importantly, a story. They were not salespeople in the traditional sense, or so the fiction went. They were detail representatives, educators, there to inform physicians about a breakthrough in pain management. The story they told was seductive because it contained elements of truth woven together with careful omission and strategic emphasis. Yes, OxyContin contained oxycodone, an opioid, a substance with a long history of addiction risk. But, the representatives would explain, the time-release formulation made it different. The drug was designed for chronic pain, for patients with ongoing conditions, not for acute, short-term discomfort. And crucially, and this point was emphasized again and again, addiction was a rare outcome when opioids were used properly, as directed, for legitimate pain. This last claim, that addiction to properly prescribed opioids was uncommon, had emerged from a small, influential letter published in the New England Journal of Medicine back in 1980, written by two researchers who had examined hospital records of patients receiving opioids. Their conclusion: addiction was rare. That letter, sometimes called the gateway to the opioid crisis by researchers who traced the crisis's origins, had been cited thousands of times by the time OxyContin arrived on the market. It had become medical dogma. It had become the foundation upon which Purdue's sales pitch was built. The marketing campaign itself was multifaceted, designed to penetrate the medical world from multiple angles at once. Purdue sponsored continuing medical education seminars for doctors, programs that helped physicians earn the credits they needed to maintain their licenses. And in these seminars, the company's message about pain management and opioids was woven throughout. Purdue funded pain advocacy organizations, groups that claimed to represent chronic pain patients, providing them with millions of dollars in grants and donations. These organizations, in turn, published educational materials about pain as an undertreatment crisis, positioning opioids as an essential tool. The company placed advertisements in medical journals, glossy and persuasive, showing images of patients freed from pain, returning to activities they had lost. There was the elderly woman gardening again, the middle-aged man playing with his grandchildren, the athlete back on the tennis court. The subtext was clear. OxyContin didn't just manage pain, it restored lives. But perhaps the most effective marketing strategy was the most direct. Purdue's representatives offered free samples to doctors, bottles of OxyContin that physicians could distribute to patients without charge. These samples were extraordinarily valuable. A doctor could hand a patient a bottle of OxyContin, say, "Try this for your pain, see how you feel." The patient would begin taking the medication, experiencing relief, and when the sample ran out, they would return to their doctor asking to continue it. A prescription would be written, a refill would be requested, and within weeks or months, what had begun as a trial of a supposedly safer opioid could become a fixture in someone's daily life. The samples were a form of introduction, a way to transform an unknown drug into something familiar, trusted, almost intimate. They created what addiction researchers would later describe as medically sanctioned access, a pathway into opioid use that seemed legitimate because it came from a doctor, wrapped in the authority and good intentions of the medical profession. The company also created what it called a patient assistance program, offering free or reduced-cost OxyContin to uninsured or underinsured patients. On the surface, this was compassion, a way to ensure that cost would never be a barrier to pain relief. But it also had the effect of expanding the market, reaching populations that might not have had easy access to expensive medications and binding those patients to the drug and to the companies that provided it. As these programs grew, as the samples accumulated in doctors' offices, as the detail representatives made their visits and left their branded stress balls and notepads and pens, something was shifting in the landscape of American medicine. The conversation about opioids was changing. The warnings that had long surrounded these drugs, the cautions about addiction, about dependence, about the dangers of long-term use, seemed to fade. In their place rose a new narrative. Opioids were being unfairly stigmatized, pain was being undertreated, and OxyContin, with its promise of steady, continuous relief, was the solution to a crisis of suffering that no one had quite acknowledged existed until Purdue Frederick described it. The sales figures reflected this shift. In 1996, the year of approval, OxyContin generated less than $1 million in revenue. By 1999, 3 years later, the company had sold over $300 million worth of the drug. By 2001, OxyContin was Purdue's cash engine, generating over $600 million annually. The growth was extraordinary, almost unprecedented in the pharmaceutical world. And with each sale, with each new patient beginning to take the medication, with each doctor's office stocking the samples, the drug was burrowing deeper into American medicine, deeper into American homes, deeper into the bodies of people who had no way of knowing that the promise of continuous relief carried within it the seeds of continuous need. To understand how a drug could reshape so many lives, it helps to know something of what happens inside us when we take it. The human brain, that 3-pound universe we carry in the dark of our skulls, speaks a chemical language that opioids know intimately. They are not invaders to the brain. They are, in a sense, visitors who speak the brain's own dialect. Deep within the brainstem and throughout the limbic system, the brain produces its own opioids, small molecules called endorphins and enkephalins. These are the body's own pain relievers, its own comforters, released when we exercise or feel genuine pleasure, or find ourselves held safely by another person. They bind to receptors scattered across the brain like locks waiting for the right key. When that binding happens, something quiets, pain retreats, anxiety softens, a small molecular sense of well-being settles into place. Now, when a person takes an opioid medication, when OxyContin dissolves in the bloodstream, when those time-released tablets begin their slow journey through the body, something remarkable and troubling happens. The opioid molecules cross the blood-brain barrier, that selective gate between body and mind, and they fit into those same receptors with such perfect geometry that the brain cannot tell the difference between its own chemical comfort and this external visitor. In fact, the opioid binds more strongly, more completely, than the body's natural opioids ever could. The sensation is not subtle, it is unmistakable. For someone in genuine pain, a person recovering from surgery, or living with cancer, or suffering from a severe injury, this can feel like mercy. The pain that dominated every breath, every thought, every moment of consciousness suddenly retreats, not into numbness, but into a kind of bearable distance. It becomes background, and with the pain gone, or vastly diminished, comes something else, a lifting sensation, a quieting of the constant vigilance that pain demands. The world feels a little softer, the self feels a little safer. But here is where the story grows complicated. The brain, despite its remarkable sophistication, is also responsive to overuse and excess. It adapts, and it adapts most intensely to the things that bring the greatest change to its chemistry. When opioids flood the brain repeatedly, something begins to shift. The brain, which has been producing its own opioids for millions of years of evolution, senses that an external supply now exists, so it begins to pull back on its own production, a response called downregulation. The receptors themselves become less sensitive, less responsive. It is as though the brain, faced with an abundant visitor, turns down the volume on its own inner voice. Over days and weeks, it takes more of the drug to achieve the same effect. The dose that once brought relief now brings merely baseline function. This is tolerance. And alongside this adaptation comes something psychologically more intricate. The brain begins to associate the drug not only with pain relief, but with safety, with normality, with the absence of discomfort. The neural pathways that encode memory, reward, and survival begin to wire the opioid into their networks. Suddenly, the drug is no longer simply a tool for managing pain. It becomes, in the deepest language the brain knows, necessary, essential, a requirement for feeling all right. When the drug is then absent, when a person tries to stop, or the supply runs low, or they simply go too long without a dose, the brain faces a crisis of its own making. It has downregulated its own opioid production. The receptors have grown less sensitive, and now there is a deficit. The brain experiences this as anguish, physical and emotional anguish. The body aches. Anxiety floods back with extraordinary intensity. Sleep becomes nearly impossible. Appetite vanishes. Everything feels wrong, broken, unbearable. Is this addiction in the clinical sense? It depends on how we define the word, and that question, perhaps, deserves its own gentle meditation. For some, addiction is defined by the loss of control over use, the continued taking of a drug despite wanting to stop. For others, it is the presence of withdrawal symptoms. Still others point to the shifting of priorities, the way the obtaining and using of the substance gradually crowds out other sources of meaning and connection. Neuroscientifically, addiction seems to involve a kind of hijacking of the brain's motivational systems. The thing that was once a means becomes an end in itself. What makes opioid addiction particularly powerful is that the reward circuitry involved is as old as survival itself. The brain systems activated by opioids are the same systems that tell us to eat when hungry, to seek connection with others, to stay alive. When the brain is trained by repeated opioid use to treat the drug as a survival necessity, The pull becomes almost unbearably strong. This is not a failure of willpower. This is neurobiology. Now, the question that haunted Purdue Pharma, and that we, in the quiet of this darkness, might ask ourselves, could the company and the doctors who prescribed OxyContin have understood this? The basic pharmacology was not new. The risk of tolerance, dependence, and addiction had been documented in medical literature for decades, even centuries, if we include opium's long history. Medical students learned these mechanisms. Researchers had mapped them. The question was not whether addiction was possible, it was whether it was likely, and whether the promises Purdue made about their drug safety were honestly weighing that likelihood. When a person takes an opioid as prescribed, at the dose intended, for the duration advised, the risk is not zero, but it is manageable, especially when combined with close medical monitoring and genuine pain. The trouble arose when three things converged: a drug that was extraordinarily potent, a marketing campaign that downplayed the addiction risk to both doctors and patients, and a landscape of pain management that had begun to see suffering itself as something that should never be tolerated. These three things, moving together, created a perfect storm. The brain, that 3-pound universe, could only respond as it was built to respond. It could only adapt, depend, and crave. But the brain that craved was not some abstract cautionary figure. It was a mother in Ohio, a teenager in Appalachia, a construction worker in New England, a person in each case who had begun with a prescription meant to help. Each of those brains, perfectly ordinary and perfectly vulnerable to the way opioids work, became part of a story that was being written not in neurotransmitters but in human lives, in families, in the slow dissolution of entire communities. Within the sleek conference rooms and carpeted corridors of Purdue Pharma's offices, something quite deliberate was unfolding in those early years, following OxyContin's 1996 launch, something that internal documents would later reveal with an almost unsettling clarity. The pharmaceutical company had assembled what many observers would describe as one of the most aggressive pharmaceutical sales forces ever mobilized in American medicine, a machine designed not with caution but with an almost singular purpose: to place OxyContin into the hands of physicians, and through those physicians, into the bodies of patients across the country. The sales representatives, or what the industry calls the detail force, were armed not merely with information about the drug's benefits, but with an entire philosophy of aggressive market penetration. These representatives were dispatched into small towns and rural communities, into family medicine clinics and pain management practices, into hospital systems and private offices where they would sit across from overworked doctors and offer something that had proven extraordinarily compelling in the pharmaceutical marketplace, a solution presented with conviction and backed by financial incentives. These salespeople were trained, coached, and motivated by compensation structures that rewarded volume and market share above all else, and the message they carried was consistent, rehearsed, and deeply persuasive. What the internal memos and sales training materials would later reveal, when they emerged through litigation and investigation, was that Purdue's own leadership understood something quite specific about OxyContin from very early on. The company knew that the drug carried real risks of addiction and misuse, and yet the sales force was instructed to downplay these risks, to characterize them as minimal, manageable, or essentially theoretical when compared to the benefits of pain relief. Training materials distributed to sales representatives told them, with a kind of unwavering certainty, that the addiction potential of OxyContin was low, that the extended-release formulation made abuse less likely, and that these were facts they could present with confidence to skeptical physicians. But what does it mean when a company simultaneously knows something is risky and tells its sales force to minimize that risk? It suggests a kind of compartmentalization, a separation between what the science might suggest and what the marketing requires. The salespeople were not necessarily lying, but they were being given a particular framework through which to interpret the truth, a lens that made the benefits appear larger and the dangers appear smaller. They were equipped with language designed to reassure, with studies and papers that supported the message they had been asked to deliver, with a kind of professional authority that made questioning these claims difficult for physicians who were themselves struggling with how to treat pain in their patients. The physician incentives that Purdue constructed were also quite remarkable in their specificity and their apparent effectiveness. The company offered doctors consulting fees for speaking about OxyContin at conferences and dinners. These speakers' bureaus, which became commonplace in pharmaceutical marketing during this era, functioned as a kind of elegant mechanism. They paid physicians to essentially endorse the company's message while wearing the credibility of the medical profession itself. A doctor who was paid to speak about OxyContin would naturally develop an investment in the drug's success. They would have a financial stake in its adoption, and other doctors who heard these colleagues speak, hearing what seemed like genuine medical judgment from peers they respected, would be more likely to prescribe the drug themselves. The dinner meetings and conference sponsorships created another layer of influence, one that was less visible but perhaps more pervasive. When Purdue sponsored a conference on pain management, when it funded the dinner that followed a medical lecture, when it placed its branded materials on every table and its representatives in every corner, it was doing something quite sophisticated. It was associating the drug with expertise, with professional advancement, with the forward-thinking community of doctors who understood that pain management was being revolutionized. To resist OxyContin, to question its use, was to position oneself as perhaps less attuned to modern medicine, less progressive in one's approach to patient care. The internal memos that emerged years later, through discovery in lawsuits and investigations by journalists and prosecutors, painted an even more particular picture. These documents suggested that Purdue executives, including members of the Sackler family's branches that controlled the company, had received reports about misuse and diversion of OxyContin quite early in the drug's commercial life. Sales representatives were reporting back through their normal channels that the drug was appearing in certain communities in problematic ways, that it was being crushed and snorted, that it was circulating in non-medical contexts, that it was being sought out by people struggling with addiction. And yet, the aggressive sales push continued, even accelerated in some cases. The messaging to physicians remained consistent. This is a safe drug. The risks are low. You can prescribe it with confidence. There's something particularly poignant about the question of what happens when a company receives early signals of harm but continues on its course. Was this a failure of conscience or a failure of perspective? Did the executives at Purdue truly believe that the benefits to pain patients outweighed the emerging harms, or had they become sufficiently insulated from the consequences of their decisions that such questions no longer penetrated the bubble of their own deliberation? The documents don't answer these questions with any simple clarity, but they do reveal a pattern: awareness without alteration, knowledge without change. The sales incentive programs also included bonuses that were explicitly tied to prescribing volumes in certain regions. Sales representatives who achieved or exceeded their targets in particular territories were rewarded with higher compensation, trips, recognition, and advancement. This created a system in which success was measured in market penetration, not in patient outcomes. If more people in a community were taking OxyContin, that was success. Whether those people benefited from it, whether they developed problems with it, whether it ultimately harmed them, these were not metrics by which performance was evaluated or compensation was determined. When you think about the nature of institutional pressure over time, how it works, how it bends the behavior of otherwise ordinary people, something worth considering emerges. The salespeople who went into those clinics and those offices were not cartoon villains. They were people doing their jobs, trying to support their families, responding to the incentive structures they had been placed within. And yet, collectively, across hundreds of salespeople and thousands of interactions, they were moving a product into the marketplace in ways that were, as would later become evident, deeply harmful. The system had made the harm possible, had made it profitable, and had made it seem like legitimate medical practice. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, as OxyContin's market share grew and its revenues climbed toward the highest tiers of pharmaceutical profitability, the awareness within Purdue of the drug's misuse potential seems only to have deepened. Calls to poison control centers about OxyContin overdoses were being tracked. Reports of addiction among patients who had been prescribed the drug were circulating through medical channels. The company's own sales data showed accelerating growth in certain regions where pain rates had not necessarily changed, suggesting that prescribing patterns were being driven not by medical need, but by marketing effectiveness. And still, the machine continued. The sales force continued to grow. The training became more sophisticated. The physician incentives expanded. The marketing budgets increased. The Sackler family, now further removed from daily operations, but still deeply invested in the company's financial success, saw their wealth accumulate at an extraordinary rate as OxyContin's revenues climbed and climbed. What began as early awareness of risks had, by the early 2000s, become something more difficult to describe in neutral terms. It had become willful disregard, or perhaps, in the peculiar moral landscape of pharmaceutical commerce, it had become something that looked, from inside the conference room, like business as usual. The pill bottle arrived in a pharmacy in rural West Virginia on an ordinary Tuesday in the autumn of 1996. It bore the Purdue Pharma logo, and inside were tablets marked OxyContin, each one promising 12 hours of relief from pain. The pharmacist had seen morphine before, of course, and various opioid formulations over the decades, but something about the way this new drug was being presented felt different. The detail man from the pharmaceutical company had spoken with such confidence, such certainty about the safety profile, time release mechanism, less addiction potential because of the controlled delivery. The prescribing information was sparse, and that very sparseness carried a kind of reassurance, as if the absence of warnings meant there was nothing to warn about. In a small town in rural Kentucky, a mining injury that might once have been treated with over-the-counter ibuprofen and rest suddenly became an opportunity for a stronger intervention. A doctor, genuinely wanting to help a patient suffering, wrote a prescription for OxyContin. The patient took the pill, and the relief was profound. Not just the dimming of pain, but a certain elevation of mood, a softening of the world's edges that made sitting in a small house on a grey afternoon feel almost bearable. Within days, that patient began to think about when the next dose would come. Not consciously yet, not in words, but in the body's quiet insistence that this feeling should happen again. Picture, if you will, a county clinic in Appalachia, where a nurse practitioner sees patients back to back, each one with a legitimate complaint. Back pain from years of labor, arthritis in hands that once worked in factories now shuttered, fibromyalgia, a condition newly recognized and still poorly understood. The clinic has limited time, limited resources for physical therapy or cognitive approaches. A prescription takes 60 seconds to write. OxyContin seemed, in those early years, like a gift to overworked providers in underserved areas, a tool that finally allowed them to address their patients' suffering meaningfully. The detail men from Purdue understood this perfectly. They targeted these exact communities where pain was endemic and skepticism about pharmaceutical solutions was low. A construction worker in rural Ohio sustained a back injury at age 39. The surgery was routine, the post-operative pain was not. His surgeon prescribed OxyContin as part of his discharge plan, with instructions to take it as directed for severe pain. What the surgeon did not mention, What he himself might not have fully understood was that OxyContin's 12-hour formulation meant that once-daily dosing could lead to a particular kind of vulnerability in the brain's reward systems. The patient followed instructions precisely. He was not seeking euphoria, he was seeking the absence of pain. But the brain does not distinguish between these intentions. It responds to the signal of opioid activation, and it begins to recalibrate its baseline expectations around that signal's presence. In the waiting room of a pain management clinic in rural Maine, a woman in her 50s filled out intake paperwork. She had suffered from migraines for decades, along with lower back pain from a car accident in her 30s. Her previous regimen of NSAIDs had caused gastric bleeding. Acetaminophen was no longer effective. She had been cycling through different treatments for so long that the prospect of something that might genuinely work felt like hope. When the pain management specialist offered OxyContin, she felt gratitude. Here was someone who believed her pain was real, who was taking it seriously. That validation was almost as powerful as the drug itself. What was happening in these small towns and rural counties during the late 1990s and early 2000s was not yet visible as a crisis. It was happening in parallel with legitimate pain treatment. It was happening in the context of the cultural narrative that Purdue had carefully constructed, a narrative that said opioids, when properly prescribed and managed, were safe. Addiction was something that happened to people with risk factors, not to ordinary people with ordinary pain. This belief system was not a lie that doctors believed despite evidence. It was a belief system that Purdue actively cultivated through its sales force, through its sponsored medical education, through the very architecture of information that physicians encountered. A farmer in Wisconsin developed severe osteoarthritis in his knees and hips. He had lived his entire life with a certain stoicism about pain, the kind that comes from decades of physical labor. But by his mid-60s, the pain was preventing him from doing the work that gave his life meaning. His family doctor, who had known him for 20 years, prescribed OxyContin. For the first time in years, the farmer could walk to the barn without wincing. He could bend to tend his animals. The relief felt like a return to himself. What he did not know, what his doctor did not tell him, was that his nervous system was already beginning the subtle process of adaptation, the way an organism adjusts to a new chemical input by requiring more of it to achieve the same effect. Beneath the surface of these individual stories, something systemic was occurring. The distribution of OxyContin in rural America was not random. It followed patterns of pain prevalence, certainly, but it also followed patterns of marketing investment and physician relationships. Purdue's salespeople identified high-prescribing doctors in small towns and rural areas and built relationships with them. They offered them educational grants, sponsored their attendance at medical conferences, provided them with materials for patient education. These gestures were not explicitly designed to increase prescriptions, but they created an environment in which OxyContin became the default option, the standard approach to moderate to severe pain. In a small city in rural Tennessee, a dental surgeon began prescribing OxyContin for patients with severe dental pain post-extraction. Dental pain is acute pain, temporary pain, pain that typically resolves within days or weeks. But OxyContin was being prescribed for these patients at doses and durations that extended far beyond the natural healing timeline. The surgeon had been educated, through Purdue's materials, that opioid therapy could be extended safely, that the risk of addiction was low in patients without a history of substance abuse. What the surgeon did not have access to was the emerging data from addiction specialists, data that would eventually show that even short-term exposure in people without prior addiction history could create physiological dependence and psychological craving. There is something particularly poignant about these early stories of OxyContin adoption in small-town America. These were genuine encounters between suffering and relief. between a population that had been chronically undertreated for pain and a pharmaceutical product that offered real analgesia. The tragedy of it lies not in the fact that the drug worked, but in the fact that the information surrounding the drug was incomplete by design. Doctors were not being told the full picture. Patients were not being told the full picture. The regulatory apparatus that should have ensured comprehensive transparency was itself shaped by an industry that had spent decades learning how to communicate selectively with physicians and the public. A man in rural West Virginia, a former coal miner with chronic pain from old injuries, felt his life transform when OxyContin came into it. For the first time in a decade, he could sit through a meal with his family without the pain consuming his attention. He could spend time with his grandchildren without the irritability that chronic pain had created. From his perspective, OxyContin was not a dangerous drug. It was a lifeline, and in a very real sense, for people with severe, chronic pain who had exhausted other options, it was exactly that. The tragedy is not that the drug existed, or that some people genuinely needed it. The tragedy is that the system by which it was distributed and prescribed was fundamentally corrupted by financial incentives that had nothing to do with matching the right drug to the right patient for the right duration. By the early 2000s, in towns and counties across rural America, something was shifting in the ordinary rhythms of daily life. Pharmacies were filling more opioid prescriptions than ever before. Emergency rooms were seeing patients in the grip of withdrawal, patients who had initially started their prescriptions legitimately and had found themselves unable to stop. Families were noticing changes in their loved ones, a kind of preoccupation, a need to refill prescriptions before they should have been empty. What had seemed like responsible pain management was beginning to show its darker face. But that face was still being obscured by a careful, elaborate architecture of messaging that maintained the official narrative of safety and efficacy. And in this same America, where OxyContin bottles were moving into medicine cabinets by the millions, something else was quietly beginning to flourish. Not the drug itself, but the entire ecosystem that had grown up around it, as though the nation were developing a second circulatory system running parallel to the first. Treatment centers, rehabilitation facilities, recovery programs with waiting lists that stretched into months and years. It is worth pausing here, in the dark of the evening, to contemplate what this simultaneity might mean. The first addiction treatment centers to emerge during the opioid surge of the 1990s and early 2000s were not the gleaming wellness retreats we might imagine. Many existed in converted buildings, repurposed offices, old motels, sometimes church basements, with linoleum floors and fluorescent lights, and the particular stale smell that follows inadequate ventilation. The people who worked in them were often underpaid counselors, nurses with double shifts, social workers who had carried their own histories of loss into the profession. They watched with a kind of slow, creeping alarm as the demographics of addiction shifted. This was not the urban, marginalized crisis of previous decades. These were accountants and teachers and construction workers and dental hygienists. These were people who had legitimately been prescribed medication, who had followed their doctor's instructions, who had still somehow found themselves unable to stop. One can almost hear the quiet conversations happening in those treatment centers at night, after visiting hours ended. The counselors standing in hallways, talking about beds they didn't have, about people being turned away, about a young mother from a suburb in Ohio who came in desperate, whose insurance wouldn't cover more than 7 days, who left still dependent and then didn't come back. About a truck driver from rural West Virginia who'd been on OxyContin for a slipped disc, and when his prescription ended, he found heroin cheaper and more reliable. These were not statistics yet. They were still people, still faces, still voices, but they were beginning to accumulate into something the nation would eventually have to reckon with, whether it wanted to or not. The parallel growth is what haunts the data, if we're being honest. As OxyContin prescriptions rose, doubling, tripling, reaching tens of millions of doses per year, the treatment industry expanded alongside it, almost as though the market itself were self-correcting through sheer human suffering. It's an elegant and terrible symmetry when you think about it. The same economy that produced the drug also produced the desperate need for its remediation, the same system that benefited from both. And yet, the treatment side of this equation was always underfunded, understaffed, underestimated. Where pharmaceutical companies received billions in revenue, treatment centers operated on threadbare margins. Where Purdue's marketing budgets were enormous, addiction recovery programs fought for grant funding that never seemed quite enough. There is something worth examining in this asymmetry. The addiction crisis by the late 1990s was creating its own sub-economy. Not just treatment centers but recovery homes, sober living facilities, medication-assisted treatment programs that prescribed medications like methadone and buprenorphine to manage dependency. Some of these operations were genuine sanctuaries, staffed by people who understood addiction as a medical and psychological condition requiring deep compassion. But others, in the emerging marketplace of human vulnerability, became something else entirely. For-profit chains began to emerge. Companies that saw addiction treatment as a revenue stream, insurance fraud, predatory practices, the phenomenon of patient brokering, where people struggling with addiction were essentially sold to treatment facilities in exchange for kickbacks. It's a quiet violence, less visible than the pills themselves, but perhaps no less corrosive. And all the while, the people in those beds, sometimes uncomfortable beds, sometimes surrounded by other people's suffering and their own, were themselves part of a strange mathematics. They became part of statistical tables, part of demographic reports, part of data that would eventually, years later, be held up to show the magnitude of what had happened. But in the moment, they were just trying not to be sick, trying to sleep, trying to remember what it felt like to want something other than the drug, trying, often, to become visible again to the people who loved them. It is perhaps easy, from a distance, to think of addiction as an individual failing, a weakness, a choice made. But when you place that individual human experience against the backdrop of what we now understand about opioid pharmacology, the way these molecules hijack the brain's reward system, the way they create physical dependency that feels indistinguishable from survival itself, the framework shifts. And when you layer atop that the reality that millions of people were prescribed these drugs in good faith, following medical advice, it becomes harder to locate blame in the individual. The blame seems to diffuse, to move sideways, to rest instead in systems and incentives, and the particular way that American capitalism learned to monetize suffering on both its creation and its remediation. The treatment centers, though, were filled with people who understood this complexity on a cellular level. They knew, because they witnessed it daily, that addiction was not a moral category but a medical one. They knew, because they watched people with resources and insurance coverage get better outcomes than people without. They knew because they answered phones from desperate family members at 3 a.m, and there was nothing they could do except listen and hold a space for a person's agony. And they kept doing it, year after year, as the crisis deepened, as the demand for beds grew faster than the supply, as the waiting lists became longer and longer. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being on the front lines of a public health crisis that seems to have no ceiling. The counselors and nurses and social workers who staffed these facilities in the 1990s and 2000s were witnessing something they couldn't quite name yet. They were seeing the outlines of a disaster that public health officials and policymakers still seemed to be debating, and they were doing their work anyway, in underfunded rooms, with insufficient tools, trying to mend what was being broken on a scale that no one, at that time, fully grasped. It might be worth thinking about this, as evening settles around us, What it means that the very same forces that created addiction were also creating, or perhaps more accurately, failing to adequately create, the infrastructure to address it, as though the market, in its infinite efficiency, had decided that both the problem and the solution were profitable, but the solution was inherently less profitable and therefore less worthy of investment. The symmetry is almost mathematical in its cruelty, almost elegant in its way, almost, but not quite. By the early years of the 2000s, something had begun to shift in the slow machinery of American journalism. The stories had been accumulating quietly for some time, scattered reports from rural counties, emergency room physicians publishing warnings in regional medical journals, rural addiction specialists, and small-town pharmacists noticing patterns that no longer resembled isolated incidents. But it was the convergence of these whispers into something louder, more organized, more impossible to dismiss, that marked the beginning of a reckoning that Purdue Pharma had perhaps not fully anticipated. The first major investigative pieces began to emerge in publications that were not yet accustomed to covering pharmaceutical malfeasance with this particular intensity. Journalists, moving slowly at first, started to pull threads that had been visible for years, but somehow woven into the fabric of medical normalcy. They began to ask questions that seemed almost obvious in retrospect. Why were small towns in Appalachia receiving shipments of opioids so disproportionate to their populations? Why were controlled substances being distributed at quantities that far exceeded any reasonable estimation of legitimate medical need? One particularly significant investigation came from journalists examining the Drug Enforcement Administration's own records, data that was, theoretically, available to anyone with patience enough to search for it. What they found was a portrait of distribution patterns that resembled not the careful, measured dispensing of a dangerous medication, but something closer to an unchecked flood. Wholesalers were shipping millions of pills to small pharmacies in rural areas. The math of it did not add up. One county in West Virginia, home to perhaps 30,000 people, received enough OxyContin in a single year to supply every resident with dozens of tablets. Multiple years of this, multiple counties. The same story repeating itself across the nation's poorest regions. Purdue's response, in these early years, was to maintain what might be called a posture of respectful disagreement. The company suggested that perhaps medical understanding had simply evolved. Perhaps pain, after all, had been undertreated for generations. Perhaps their marketing was simply filling a genuine medical void. The company had, by this time, developed a kind of philosophical armor, the belief, stated and restated, that they were not responsible for what happened after a prescription was written. They were a pharmaceutical manufacturer. They were not doctors. They were not law enforcement. They were simply providing a medication that the medical community had determined was necessary. But parallel to these corporate assurances, internal documents were beginning to surface. Investigators and journalists, armed with freedom of information requests and the patience of those uncovering uncomfortable truths, started to access memos and emails that painted a different picture than the one Purdue was presenting to the public. These documents revealed that company sales representatives had been trained to minimize the addiction risks of OxyContin. They revealed that Purdue executives had received reports of overdose deaths and diversion, the movement of prescription medications into illegal markets, and had continued their aggressive marketing campaigns regardless. One particularly striking element of these early investigations was the discovery of the company's training materials for sales representatives. These documents suggested that representatives should tell doctors that the addiction risk was in fact quite low. They cited medical literature selectively. They pointed to a single letter published in a prestigious medical journal decades earlier. A letter, not a rigorous study, which had suggested that addiction was rare in hospital patients receiving opioids for acute pain. That one letter, written in a different era and addressing a different population, became the foundation for claims that would eventually be recognized as fundamentally misleading. It was a sleight of hand performed with citations and medical authority, the kind of manipulation that is all the more effective because it traffics in the language of science itself. As these investigations deepened, reporters began to interview patients and families directly. They spoke with people in Kentucky and Ohio and West Virginia who had lost loved ones to overdose. They documented the progression, a back injury, a dental procedure, a legitimate moment of pain that had been met with a powerful opioid, followed by months of escalating use, increasing tolerance, and eventually addiction. They interviewed addiction specialists who had been warning about this crisis for years, physicians working in rural health clinics who had seen their entire communities transform over the course of a decade. These stories, multiplied across dozens of interviews and dozens of publications, began to create a counter-narrative to the one Purdue had so carefully constructed. The role of financial incentives also began to receive scrutiny. How many doctors, reporters wondered, had received funding from Purdue Pharma for speaking engagements or consulting work? How many had been flown to lavish conferences where Purdue sponsored the events and controlled the messaging? The landscape of pharmaceutical influence in American medicine began to look less like the transparent, above-board interactions that regulation was supposed to ensure, and more like a system designed to create preference through relationships, through gifts, through the subtle building of obligation. What made these early investigations particularly powerful was that they did not rely solely on abstract data or corporate malfeasance. They humanized the crisis. They put faces to statistics. A woman in a small town who had become addicted after a knee surgery, a teenage boy whose mother had died of an overdose, whose father had then also become dependent, whose family had been unmade by a medication that had been promised to be safe. These were not political arguments. They were not abstracted policy debates. They were the intimate details of American family life, derailed by a substance that had been aggressively marketed and broadly prescribed. By the mid-2000s, the picture had shifted enough that Purdue could no longer maintain complete silence. The company began to issue statements. They acknowledged that OxyContin abuse was a problem, but they framed it as a problem of misuse, of patients not taking the medication as prescribed, of criminal diversion. This framing was crucial. It allowed the company to acknowledge the crisis without acknowledging responsibility for creating the conditions in which that crisis could flourish. The medication itself was not the problem, this narrative suggested. The problem was how people were using it. Yet with each investigation, with each published piece of reporting, the company's position became incrementally more difficult to maintain. The internal documents were damaging in ways that no public relations campaign could quite overcome. When journalists published excerpts of emails showing that company executives had discussed whether to pursue criminal convictions for people who had diverted OxyContin, or when documents revealed that salespeople had been instructed to downplay addiction risks, the gap between what Purdue was saying and what Purdue had been doing became difficult to bridge. The role of medical journals themselves also came under examination during this period. How had prestigious publications allowed their pages to be filled with promotional material disguised as objective research? How had studies funded by Purdue been presented alongside studies by independent researchers, creating a false sense of debate where little real scientific disagreement existed? The mechanisms of pharmaceutical influence in medical publishing were, if anything, more sophisticated and more deeply embedded in the system than anyone had initially recognized. As these investigations accumulated, as reporters from more and more publications began to examine the crisis and trace it back toward Purdue, toward the Sackler family, toward the system that had allowed a single company to reshape the landscape of pain management in America, something began to shift in the broader culture. The story could no longer be contained as a regional crisis affecting rural communities. It could no longer be dismissed as an isolated phenomenon or the result of individual misuse. It was becoming, slowly, inexorably, a national reckoning. And yet, in these early 2000s, Purdue Pharma remained extraordinarily profitable. The company continued to market OxyContin aggressively. The medications continued to flow into communities. The crisis continued to deepen, even as the investigations intensified. There was a strange dissonance between what journalists were revealing and what was actually changing in the real world. It would take years, many more years, before these investigations would begin to have the legislative and legal consequences that might have slowed the machinery of distribution. For now, they existed as troubling truths circulating through the media landscape, read and absorbed, and, in many cases, forgotten by the very next week's news cycle. But something had been set in motion. The silence that had protected Purdue was cracking. The narrative that the company had so carefully constructed was being challenged by evidence, by documentation, by the voices of those who had suffered. And while the immediate impact of these investigations was limited, they represented the beginning of a process, a slow, frustrating, but ultimately undeniable process, through which a country would begin to understand what had happened, and who had made it happen, and what the costs had been. By the early 2000s, the machinery of legal consequence had begun to turn, though slowly, almost with the reluctance of something waking from a long sleep. The first lawsuits arrived not as thunderclaps but as whispers that gradually accumulated into an unmistakable hum. State attorneys general, prodded by mounting evidence and public pressure, opened investigations that would eventually touch nearly every corner of how Purdue had conducted its business. And yet, what becomes remarkable when you trace this period is not the speed of reckoning, but rather the careful, deliberate distance the Sackler family began to place between themselves and the company their own ingenuity had built. It is worth pausing here to understand the architecture of this separation. Purdue Pharma, by the early years of the new millennium, existed as a kind of legal shield. The company was privately held, controlled by family trusts and holding companies, which meant that unlike public corporations answerable to shareholders and regulators, its inner workings could remain largely opaque. The family did not sit in executive chairs with their names on office doors. Instead, they worked through a carefully constructed network of boards, advisors, and professional managers, creating layers of plausible distance between themselves and specific decisions. When lawsuits began to name individuals, when depositions were demanded, this structure became invaluable. A question might arise. Did the Sacklers themselves know of the company's marketing practices? Did they receive reports about addiction rates? The answer, preserved in corporate memory, lived in boardrooms they did not personally occupy, in meetings where their interests were represented by others, in memos that bore the signatures of subordinates rather than family patriarchs. The first major legal reckoning came in 2007, when Purdue Pharma itself pleaded guilty to charges of misleading the public about OxyContin's addiction potential. The company agreed to pay $635 million, a sum that at the time seemed enormous, yet which later analysts would note represented less than 2 weeks of the company's peak revenues. 3 executives, current and former, faced criminal charges: a chief medical officer, a vice president, and a former president. They were convicted, served time, and received fines. The family members whose names appeared nowhere on the plea agreement continued their work, continued their philanthropy, continued their lives largely uninterrupted. One might ask whether this outcome was simply the natural consequence of corporate law, where the entity absorbs liability while individuals remain insulated, or whether it reflected something more deliberate, a system navigated with the help of tremendous resources and sophisticated legal counsel. What followed in the years immediately after that plea were congressional inquiries and hearings that brought forth testimony about the company's practices. Representatives and senators examined evidence of aggressive sales tactics, of payments to physicians, of downplaying addiction risks in marketing materials. Purdue's executives testified, defending their actions as consistent with the medical science of the time, as responses to legitimate patient suffering, as separated from the criminal misuse that had occurred beyond their control. These were not necessarily false statements. They contained elements of truth, but they also contained careful framings, strategic emphasis, and the particular way that language can acknowledge a problem while suggesting it lies somewhere else, in someone else's hands. The congressional record from this period reads as a slow accumulation of irrefutable facts, met with equally persistent denials or reframings. A representative might ask about internal communications showing knowledge of diversion and misuse. A company witness would acknowledge the documents but explain that the company had taken steps to address such concerns. The disconnect between what documents revealed about internal awareness and what public statements had claimed, that was precisely the gap these hearings were designed to illuminate. Yet illumination and consequence, as many observers noted, were not the same thing. The hearings produced reports, recommendations, calls for reform. They did not, in their immediate aftermath, produce dramatic personal accountability for the family members whose vision had launched this product into the world. By the early years of the 2010s, a particular pattern had become visible to those following the unfolding story. State attorneys general continued to investigate. Victims' families filed civil suits. Journalists pursued deeper investigations into Purdue's marketing practices and early awareness of addiction risks. Meanwhile, the Sackler family itself remained remarkably present in the spaces that confer legitimacy and enduring cultural memory. The museum walls where their names remained inscribed, the university buildings they had funded, the cultural institutions that had benefited from their philanthropic largesse. To walk through certain museums or across certain campuses was to encounter their name in spaces devoted to beauty, education, human flourishing. The separation between the company and the family was not merely legal, but also spatial, moral even. The Sacklers' public identity continued to be that of cultural patrons, collectors, benefactors. The company's identity, increasingly beleaguered, increasingly scrutinized, remained distinct, almost as though these were two entirely separate stories that had somehow become entangled. What is intriguing about this period, when one sits with the details across multiple sources and accounts, is how corporate structure enabled a form of personal distance that might otherwise have seemed impossible. The family did not directly employ the sales representatives who spoke to physicians. They did not sign the marketing materials themselves. They did not author the internal memos that, when later revealed, would show awareness of problems the company had publicly minimized. All of these things existed in the corporate space, the company space, separate from the family space. A family member might receive quarterly reports on company performance, might discuss strategy in board meetings, might make investment decisions or voice preferences about the company's direction. But was this the same as personally orchestrating the decisions that generated the crisis? Legal systems designed around corporate liability provided a clear answer: no, not necessarily. The corporation could be guilty while its owners remained, in the most literal sense, innocent of specific criminal acts. Yet there is another way of looking at these years, a perspective that emerges if you consider not legal architecture, but historical responsibility. The company had been founded by the Sacklers. The family's wealth had accrued directly from pharmaceutical sales. Their fortune had been built on trust in their medications, on the carefully cultivated brand identity Arthur had pioneered. When that trust was betrayed, when evidence emerged that the company had minimized addiction risks in its marketing, that it had known about diversion into illegal markets, that it had continued aggressive promotion despite mounting evidence of harm, who bore responsibility for that betrayal? The law provided one answer: History, perhaps, will provide another. And the Sacklers, as these legal proceedings unfolded throughout the 2000s and into the 2010s, seemed to sense this distinction. They began, gradually, to distance themselves not just legally, but also publicly from the company they had created. The marble plaques began to come down quietly, almost shyly, as if the institutions themselves felt some embarrassment about what they now knew. It happened first not with fanfare or public ceremony, but with the careful work of conservators and facilities teams, removing brass letters that had gleamed for decades under museum lighting. The Sackler name, which had been etched into the architecture of American cultural life with such permanence, such confidence in its own benevolence, began to vanish the way morning fog recedes from a landscape, gradually enough that some visitors might not immediately notice the absence, yet leaving behind a kind of shadow where something had been. In 2019, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York announced it would remove the Sackler name from its ancient art wing. The museum had received significant donations from members of the family over the years, and for decades the name had carried an aura of sophisticated philanthropy. But as the scope of the opioid crisis became impossible to ignore, as lawsuits multiplied and internal company documents emerged suggesting the family knew far more about the dangers of OxyContin than they had admitted, something shifted in the cultural consciousness. Museums found themselves caught between gratitude for past gifts and a growing sense that accepting money born from the suffering of hundreds of thousands of people came with a moral cost they could no longer ignore. The Metropolitan's decision opened a door, and other institutions rushed to reckon with what had previously seemed unquestionable. The American Museum of Natural History removed the name from its Hall of Human Origins. The Louvre in Paris, which housed the Sackler wing of Islamic art, made plans to strip the family's name from its galleries. The National Gallery in London followed, one by one, across the globe, in cities where the Sacklers had sought to leave their imprint through the gift of beauty and culture. That imprint was being carefully, ceremoniously undone. But this erasure was not simply about taking down plaques. It represented something more profound, a public reckoning with the very nature of philanthropic legacy itself. For generations, American culture had operated according to an almost unexamined principle, that wealth, no matter how it was made, could be effectively laundered through generosity. A family fortune accumulated through the aggressively marketed sale of addictive medications could be transformed into something noble and permanent through the donation of art galleries, chairs of medicine, scholarships in the family name. The donor's intentions were assumed to be pure, or at least their monetary contribution was accepted as sufficient redemption for whatever moral questions might linger. The Sacklers had been particularly skilled at this arithmetic. They understood that the acquisition of great art, the endowment of museums, the patronage of universities, created a particular kind of social armor. It suggested cultivation, taste, a desire to elevate human experience. And for a long time, it worked. The family moved through philanthropic circles with the ease of people whose money had cleansed itself through the alchemy of institutional acceptance. But the mathematics of that redemption began to shift as the true extent of the opioid crisis became visible. When one family's philanthropic giving could be roughly calculated against the number of overdose deaths in a single year, the equation became harder to balance in their favor. University trustees found themselves facing difficult questions, particularly in schools of medicine and public health. How could an institution dedicated to healing accept money from a family whose marketed product had caused so much suffering? Tufts University, where Arthur Sackler had studied and later made significant contributions, removed his name from its medical school. Yale, Boston University, Columbia, universities across the country began to reconsider what it meant to bear the Sackler name in their departments. The symbolic weight of a name in architecture, carved in stone or cast in bronze, suddenly felt heavier more accusatory. The process was not instantaneous, nor was it uniform. Some institutions moved quickly, eager to distance themselves from the controversy. Others took longer, wrestling with questions of precedent and principle. What of other donors whose money came from sources that might be questioned? Tobacco, alcohol, weapons manufacturing. To remove the Sackler name, did one not open oneself to a cascade of uncomfortable questions about the origins of other fortunes that had endowed other halls? Some museums and universities chose not to remove the names, defending their decisions with language about separating the gifts from the circumstances of their giving, about the enduring value of art and science regardless of donor identity. But even those institutions often felt obliged to issue public statements, to explain and defend their position. The Sackler name, which had once conferred a kind of automatic legitimacy, now required justification. There was something almost poignant in watching these erasures unfold, if one chose to feel pathos for the family. The Sacklers had achieved something that most philanthropists dream of: immortality through institutional naming. To have a wing, a chair, a scholarship bearing one's name was to attain a form of permanence, a guarantee that your existence would be remembered and honored. Yet all of that permanence had proven fragile in the end, contingent on factors: public forgiveness, sustained silence, the ability to separate gift from giver, that had ultimately not held firm. The removal of the names happened in a curious liminal space, neither as swift punishment nor as slow erosion. It was fast enough to feel like definitive moral judgment, yet stretched out over months and years in a way that suggested institutions were still wrestling with the decision. Some plaques came down because of direct pressure from activists and documentarians, from journalists who made the connection between donation and harm impossible to ignore. Others were quietly removed as part of larger renovations or rebranding efforts, given minimal press attention, as if the institutions hoped the erasure itself might go unnoticed. But it could not go unnoticed, because the absence of a name, once it has been present, becomes a kind of presence in itself. Visitors to the Met's now unnamed ancient art wing had to consciously or unconsciously register that something had changed, even if they could not quite say what. What was left behind when the names came down was something that had perhaps always been there, but had been obscured by the brilliant veneer of philanthropic glamour, the specific, irreducible pain of the crisis itself. Museums and universities, by removing the Sackler name, were implicitly acknowledging that in a world of finite moral capacity, there was a limit to how much institutional prestige could redeem actual human suffering. The gift, in other words, could not be separated from its source. The art remained art, the research remained valuable, but the naming itself had become a kind of lie, a statement that could no longer be made without introducing a toxic cognitive dissonance. For the family itself, these removals represented a different kind of loss than what they had experienced through litigation. Money could be paid out, settlements could be reached, bankruptcy proceedings could be navigated through sophisticated legal maneuvers, but a name carved in stone, once removed, cannot be easily returned. The erasure was public and permanent in a way that financial penalties, for all their enormous sums, could somehow be more easily absorbed into the abstract machinery of wealth management. A family that had believed itself safe through the elevation of culture and beauty found that neither could shield them from the judgment of history. Yet even as the plaques came down, even as the official erasing occurred, there remained profound questions about what this reckoning truly changed. Did the removal of a name from a museum wing undo the harm caused by the marketing of OxyContin? Did it bring back the individuals lost to overdose? Did it prevent future reliance on family money by institutions still desperately short of funding? The erasure, whatever its moral weight, was ultimately a symbolic act, a collective agreement to stop pretending that the family had simply been generous philanthropists, worthy of permanent institutional honor. But symbols matter, They shape how we think about accountability, about the relationship between wealth and legacy, about whether money can truly be cleansed of its origins no matter how beautifully it is displayed. In the quiet removal of those plaques, something shifted in the American understanding of philanthropy itself, a recognition that some fortunes carry with them a kind of permanent stain that no amount of generosity can ultimately erase. By the time the bankruptcy petition was filed in 2019, Purdue Pharma found itself ensnared in roughly 3,000 lawsuits, a number so large it had become almost abstract, each case a thread in an immense tapestry of suffering that the company could no longer ignore or manage through the usual channels of settlement and public relations. The filing itself was a peculiar kind of reckoning, one that looked on its surface like surrender, but which, to many observers and legal scholars, resembled something closer to a masterful final maneuver, a way of consolidating all those dispersed claims into a single proceeding where they might be more easily negotiated, reduced, or reshaped into something the Sackler family could ultimately survive. The mechanics of the bankruptcy were, in their way, as intricate as the marketing campaigns that had built Purdue's fortune. When a company files for Chapter 11 protection, the form of bankruptcy designed to allow reorganization rather than immediate liquidation, it triggers what is known as an automatic stay, a legal barrier that prevents most creditors from pursuing collection efforts outside the bankruptcy process itself. For Purdue, this meant that the thousands of cases brought by states, cities, counties, Native American tribes, and individual opioid addiction victims could no longer advance independently through the courts. Instead, they were funneled into a single massive negotiation, presided over by a bankruptcy judge who would ultimately determine how Purdue's remaining assets would be distributed among the claimants. It was, in essence, a reset button. And this may be worth sitting with for a moment, because it raises a question that haunted legal observers throughout the proceedings. Did bankruptcy, which was nominally created to protect struggling businesses and provide them a path to reorganization, end up protecting the architects of Purdue's strategy from the full weight of accountability? The settlement discussions that followed were baroque in their complexity. Purdue's initial restructuring plan proposed that the company would emerge from bankruptcy as a so-called opioid abatement trust, a public health-focused entity rather than a private pharmaceutical company. This transformation was theoretically elegant. The company that had spent decades marketing painkillers to the masses would now be devoted to addressing the very crisis it had helped create, funded by opioid revenue that would be redirected toward treatment, recovery, and harm reduction programs. The idea was that Purdue would effectively resurrect itself in a new form, shedding its past while continuing to operate under court supervision, with the profits from any remaining business channeled toward remediation. It sounded, in some lights, almost like justice. But beneath this architectural elegance lay deeper questions that never quite found resolution. The family's role in these proceedings became, intriguingly, a central point of contention. Throughout the legal discovery process that preceded the bankruptcy filing, documents had emerged suggesting that various members of the Sackler family, particularly from the Mortimer and Raymond branches that controlled the company, had received enormous dividend payments while the company knew internally that OxyContin was being diverted, misused, and fueling addiction on a catastrophic scale. Internal emails and memos, some of which became public through court filings and investigative journalism, revealed a concerning pattern. Executives had discussed what they delicately termed doctor shopping, the practice where addicted individuals would visit multiple physicians to obtain duplicate prescriptions, and yet marketing efforts continued largely unabated. Sales reps received bonuses based on volume. The message to the field was clear, even if never explicitly stated: push the drug and worry about the consequences later. Yet when the bankruptcy proceedings began in earnest, the Sackler family members themselves were not defendants. Purdue Pharma was the bankrupt entity, and while the company had been controlled and directed by family members, a crucial legal distinction had been maintained. The family members held the company separately, through trusts and corporate structures, which meant that their personal assets, their estates, their art collections, their real estate holdings, the billions they had accumulated, remained technically beyond the reach of the bankruptcy process itself. This separation, one might observe quietly, had not occurred by accident. The Sacklers had long been advised by sophisticated legal counsel. Their wealth had been carefully partitioned into multiple jurisdictions and legal entities, a practice known colloquially as asset protection, and which, while not illegal, served the practical effect of insulating family wealth from litigation that might otherwise claim it. The question of whether the Sacklers themselves should be subject to bankruptcy claims became a heated debate among the state's attorneys general, individual victims' lawyers, and bankruptcy professionals. Some argued that the Sackler family members had effectively directed Purdue's actions and should therefore bear personal liability alongside the company. Others contended that to pierce the corporate veil and go after family members' personal assets would set a dangerous precedent, potentially discouraging entrepreneurship or upending long-standing corporate law principles. And there, one might pause to consider, lay a kind of philosophical tension at the heart of the proceeding. In a legal system designed to protect the separation between a company and its owners, how does accountability truly reach the people who shaped the company's direction and reaped its rewards? The initial settlement offer that emerged from these discussions was in the range of $10 to $12 billion, a figure that, while substantial and indeed the largest settlement related to a public health crisis in American history, represented a fraction of the wealth that the Sackler family had extracted from Purdue over the decades. Moreover, a significant portion of that settlement was contingent on the family making voluntary contributions from their personal assets, which they resisted with surprising vigor. There were negotiations, public statements of reluctance, legal arguments about whether family members had broken any laws and thus owed any restitution at all. In some instances, family members appeared to view themselves as victims of mismanagement by lower-level executives, rather than as directors of a strategy. One of the most intricate negotiations involved something called third-party releases, a legal mechanism by which the Sackler family members themselves could be released from potential future civil liability in exchange for their voluntary contributions. In other words, if the family paid a certain amount into the settlement, they would be legally shielded from additional claims, even from individuals or entities that had not participated in the bankruptcy process. Objectors, including state attorneys general, addiction advocacy groups, and lawyers representing individual victims, argued strenuously that it was fundamentally unjust to grant legal immunity to the family members while the company faced bankruptcy and restructuring. The court faced a thorny question. Could the bankruptcy process legitimately extend protections to parties who were not themselves bankrupt? The bankruptcy code seemed to suggest no, and yet creative legal arguments were made in favor of the arrangement, often framed around the practical necessity of getting all parties to agree to a settlement. The settlement discussions stretched on for years, each iteration slightly different, each one encountering new objections and legal challenges. The original proposal was rejected by the bankruptcy judge as insufficient and unfairly skewed toward protecting the family. A revised proposal was offered. That too faced criticism. In some instances, states' attorneys general, particularly from states that had been hardest hit by the opioid crisis, withdrew their participation in the settlement negotiations, arguing that they could achieve greater accountability through other legal channels or through separate settlements with other entities in the pharmaceutical supply chain. Individual victims' representatives spoke, sometimes with raw emotion, about the inadequacy of any monetary settlement as compensation for lost loved ones. And throughout these proceedings, a quieter question persisted beneath the surface. What did accountability actually mean in this context? The legal system offers certain remedies: monetary damages, injunctive relief, criminal prosecution. But does any of these truly address what has sometimes been called the epidemiological dimension of the crisis? The fact that hundreds of thousands of people suffered and died because of decisions made in corporate boardrooms. Money redistributed through courts and settlements can fund treatment centers, addiction education, harm reduction programs. These are meaningful things, but they occur after the harm, in response to it. The legal accountability of Purdue Pharma, in many ways, did not reverse the opioid crisis so much as attempt to monetize its aftermath, to convert human suffering into a financial figure that could be negotiated and settled. The Sackler family, meanwhile, adopted what might be described as a posture of strategic silence, punctuated by carefully worded statements. They did not publicly defend the marketing practices of Purdue, nor did they fully acknowledge personal responsibility for directing them. Instead, through their legal representatives, they indicated regret about the opioid crisis more broadly, while maintaining that they had not acted unlawfully and that the company's executives had, in some cases, acted contrary to family wishes. This narrative, that family members were themselves misled by the organizations they created and funded, circled back to a curious paradox. If the Sacklers had truly lost control of Purdue and were unaware of its practices, what did that say about their stewardship and their willingness to monitor the empire they had constructed? And if they had been aware and had directed the strategy, then the claims of ignorance rang hollow. By 2021 and into 2022, the bankruptcy negotiations had evolved into a settlement framework that most parties, though not all, came to accept. The Sackler family agreed to contribute $3 billion of their own wealth, a figure that was unprecedented in the context of pharmaceutical litigation, though still representing, according to many estimates, perhaps a quarter or less of the total wealth they had accumulated. The Mortimer and Raymond branches made slightly different contributions, reflecting the fact that the family's wealth was itself divided among various branches and entities. In exchange, they received broad legal releases from civil liability, though the mechanics of these releases remained contested and contingent on the settlement receiving final court approval. The company itself would be restructured. Purdue Pharma would continue operating under court supervision, with its remaining opioid revenue, still substantial, interestingly, because OxyContin had not been removed from the market, but rather reformulated and remarketed as a drug of last resort for legitimate chronic pain, channeled toward a public health trust. The company's opioid operations would be eventually shut down, though this process was gradual. What remained was a kind of strange half-life. Purdue Pharma, the entity, would exist in a diminished form, operating not as a profit-generating concern for the Sacklers, but as a legally constrained vehicle for distributing settlement funds. And yet, even with this framework in place, the question of true accountability remained unresolved. No member of the Sackler family faced criminal charges. The company paid a settlement, but the company itself was a legal fiction created by the family. The family contributed wealth, but retained control over how much of that contribution actually came from them personally versus from the company's dwindling assets. In the end, what remains is not the towering names on gallery walls, but the work of removing them. Museums across the continent faced a peculiar kind of sadness in the early 2020s, when the letters spelling Sackler began to come down from their marble and glass. The sound of that removal, the careful tools, the workers on scaffolds, carried an unspoken question that no one quite knows how to answer. What do we do with the art that corruption paid for? The paintings themselves did not change, the scholarship did not become less true, and yet everything shifted in the seeing of it. History, we might remember, does not move in neat lines. It moves in the way shadows lengthen across a room as the afternoon deepens. For decades, the Sackler name meant philanthropy, meant taste, meant the blessing of culture upon a family's fortune. No one asked too loudly where the money originated, because asking seemed impolite. Museums, universities, hospitals, all of them received donations with gratitude and minimal scrutiny, as though the source of wealth was less important than the destination of it. This is perhaps one of the quietest truths of how inherited harm becomes historical amnesia. We allow it because we are trained to believe that enough time and enough money can wash clean the origin of things. But what we are learning, slowly and often against institutional resistance, is that some kinds of reckoning cannot be postponed indefinitely. The body has a memory that outlasts denial. Addiction leaves marks on families, on communities, on entire generations. Those marks do not fade when bankruptcy papers are signed or when settlements reach the billions. They continue, they teach, and in teaching, they slowly reshape how we tell the story of where the money came from. Consider the texture of this moment, this particular hinge in history where we find ourselves. The Sacklers themselves have largely retreated from public view, having carefully arranged their legal separation from the day-to-day machinery of Purdue Pharma. The company itself has proposed itself as a public benefit corporation, a kind of redemption narrative written in corporate structure. Whether such a thing can genuinely transform, whether a company born from aggressive pharmaceutical marketing can truly become something else, remains an open question that we sit with, rather than answer too quickly. What strikes many observers now is how the family's accumulated art collection, paintings worth hundreds of millions, perhaps billions, exists in a strange limbo. Some museums have rejected the Sackler name entirely, returning money or banishing plaques. Others struggle with the paradox of keeping transformative art while severing the name. It is a physical and philosophical problem that architecture cannot quite solve. You cannot undonate a painting. You cannot unmake the years that a donor wing existed, the school children who learned that a name meant patronage, the subtle association between wealth and cultural blessing. There is something almost ancient in this pattern, if we look at it from sufficient distance. Throughout history, fortunes built on suffering have sought legitimacy through art and learning. The money changes hands, the origin becomes more distant, the shame becomes absorbed into institutions. What is different now is that the speed of information, the persistence of documentation, the accumulated voices of those harmed, these things do not allow the distancing to happen as completely as it once did. The distance still exists, the harm is still sometimes obscured, but the machinery of forgetting has become visibly broken in a way that makes people uneasy. The families themselves face a particular kind of reckoning that is neither prosecution nor absolution. Legal settlements have been reached, though the full amounts depend on how you count them and how you measure the pain they are meant to address. Billions of dollars, yes, but also a name stripped from institutions, the knowledge that one's family name, which meant education and elegance and the preservation of human creativity, now carries an association with addiction, suffering, and what many observers see as a calculated deception of physicians and patients. This is perhaps one of the slowest and most durable forms of justice, the alteration of how a name is held in memory. It is not the drama of criminal conviction, though some have pursued that. It is not the full transparency of all internal knowledge, though many have fought for that disclosure. Instead, it is something quieter and more persistent, the understanding that will not quite disappear, the context that will not be forgotten, the connection between a family name and the suffering of others that cannot be ceremonially erased. And yet, and this is where the meditation deepens into its most uncertain territory, there is also something worth sitting with about the nature of institutional corruption itself. The Sacklers were not alone in seeing opioids as an opportunity. The marketing strategies, while aggressive and at times deceptive, existed within a landscape where many pharmaceutical companies operated similarly. Physicians who prescribed OxyContin without the deep understanding of its addiction potential were themselves caught in a system of incomplete information and professional influence. Patients who became addicted were vulnerable in ways that addiction exploits regardless of the name on the packaging. None of this erases the Sackler family's particular role, their internal communications, their knowledge about misuse, their funding of physicians and researchers, their support for the narrative that opioids were safe. All of these constitute a specific historical record. But it does suggest that the story is not quite as simple as the story of one family's greed and consequent punishment. It is rather a story of how entire systems can become oriented toward harm without any single person feeling entirely responsible. This is the most troubling kind of historical pattern, because it suggests that the removal of one family's name from a gallery wall, though symbolically important, does not solve the deeper problem. What remains then, as the night settles and as we rest with this story, is an awareness. The awareness that legacy is not something that happens after we die, something that can be controlled or shaped by the quality of our donations to museums. Legacy is what happens in the time that we are alive, in the decisions we make about how to use wealth and influence, in the networks we create, and the narratives we allow to be told. The Sacklers attempted to build a legacy through the centuries-old method of patronage, and for a long time it seemed to work. The museums took the money, the wings were built, the plaques were engraved. But underneath, the other legacy was also being written. In small towns and rural communities, in neighborhoods where addiction spiraled beyond anyone's capacity to help, in families fractured by opioid dependence, in the quiet statistics of overdose deaths, that legacy was accumulating too. And this legacy, we are beginning to understand, cannot be outpaced or outbid by the legacy of cultural patronage. There is a question, perhaps, that historians will sit with for generations. What do we owe to the families destroyed by a product marketed by a wealthy dynasty? And another, nested inside the first, does the removal of a name from a museum wall constitute any form of answer to that question? We do not know yet. The institutions continue to decide, slowly, case by case, whether they will keep the money and lose the name, or reject the money and assert a principle they perhaps should have asserted decades ago. Each decision is its own small act of historical reckoning. And in the accumulation of these small reckonings, something shifts in how the story is told. The story becomes not the story of a family's triumph and cultural blessing, but the story of a family's role in a particular moment when medicine and marketing converged in ways that harmed millions. That is the story that will be remembered. That is the legacy that will persist, not because of any single institution's decision, but because enough people refuse to forget, refuse to allow the distance between the art and its origin to become too great, refuse to let the money do its traditional work of washing clean the past. This is how history quietly reckons with fortunes built on harm, not all at once, not in dramatic moments, but in the slow, persistent work of remembering what we would prefer to forget, in the careful documentation, in the refusal to accept the narrative that money and time together dissolve moral weight, in the understanding that a name on a museum wall, or the removal of that name, matters because it says something about what we collectively believe about the relationship between wealth, culture, and responsibility. And as we drift now into the quieter part of the evening, we might sit with the thought that this reckoning is not finished. It may never be finished. The opioid crisis continues. Families are still being broken. The question of accountability remains partly unsettled, held in the space between legal settlements and genuine moral transformation, between institutional changes and individual conscience. History is still writing itself. We are still, all of us, part of how it gets told. The names are coming down from the walls, but the story they tell, and the story that will replace them, is still being decided by all of us together, in what we choose to remember, in what we choose to question, in what we choose to no longer accept as inevitable. That work continues, quietly, in the dark, in the spaces between institutions and stories, in the hearts of those who refuse to forget. And perhaps that quiet persistence, that refusal to let the past be neatly stored away and made beautiful, is itself a kind of justice. A justice that moves slowly, that leaves marks, that teaches, that will not easily be erased.